take a moment to let the day settle behind you. Let your breathing find its rhythm. Tonight, we are stepping aboard a wooden ship in winter. The year might be 1720 or 1680, or any winter in the age when men crossed oceans under sail. The location is somewhere in the cold northern waters, where winter air cuts through rigging and sea spray freezes on the deck. This is not a story of battles or treasure. It is simply about rest. About how sailors and pirates found sleep in a place where warmth could not exist. Where fire, the most basic source of heat, was forbidden entirely. For months at a time, these men lived inside a wooden structure that moved constantly with the sea. At night, they descended below deck into crowded, dark spaces that were always damp and always cold. There was no stove to gather around, no hearth to dry their clothes, only the ship itself and the methods they developed to endure. We will follow one winter night from the perspective of those who lived it. We will see how they prepared their sleeping spaces, what they wore, and how they managed to rest in conditions that seem almost impossible to endure. So settle in. Let the story move at its own pace. There is nowhere else to be. A sailing ship in the 1700s was a complete environment. Once a crew left port, the vessel became their entire world. The deck beneath their feet, the masts above their heads, the hull around them. This wooden structure was home, workplace, and shelter combined into one. These ships were built from timber. Oak planks formed the hull. Pine masts reached upward. The entire frame was held together with iron fastenings and wooden pegs. Every seam between planks was sealed with oakum, loose hemp fibres packed tightly into gaps, and then covered with tar or pitch to keep water out. The result was a structure that creaked and flexed with every wave. Wood worked against wood, ropes strained against timber. The ship was never still, never silent. It responded to wind and current with constant movement. Below deck, this wooden world became more confined. The crew lived in spaces designed primarily for function, not comfort. Gun decks held the cannons that defined a warship's purpose. Storage holds contained barrels of provisions, salt pork, ship's biscuit, dried peas, and water. Rope lockers held the miles of cordage needed to control the sails. Powder magazines stored the gunpowder that made the cannons effective. Between these functional spaces, sailors found room to sleep. There were no dedicated sleeping quarters for common crew. Instead, they hung their hammocks wherever space allowed, usually on the gun decks among the cannons themselves. The wooden construction created a specific atmosphere. Tar and pitch gave off a medicinal smell that permeated everything. Fresh timber gradually absorbed moisture from the sea air. Older wood developed its own scent as it aged and weathered. Together, these created the distinctive smell of a ship, something noticed immediately by anyone coming aboard but gradually fading into background awareness for those who lived there. Light below deck came through hatches and gun ports when weather permitted. On calm days, these openings allowed fresh air and daylight to filter down. But when storms approached, everything was battened shut. Then the lower decks became dark spaces lit only by carefully controlled lanterns. The ship's interior was organised by a strict hierarchy. Officers had cabins, small private spaces with fixed bunks and some degree of insulation from the cold and damp. The captain's cabin occupied the stern wall, where the ship's motion was slightly less violent. Junior officers shared smaller cabins nearby. Common sailors had no such privacy. Their sleeping space was communal and temporary. Each morning, hammocks came down and were rolled up. Each evening, they went back up. The gun deck transformed twice daily between dormitory and workspace. This wooden world had clear boundaries. The deck above provided protection from rain and spray. The hull planks separated interior from ocean. But these boundaries were never absolute. Water found its way through aging seams. Cold penetrated the wood. The sea was always present, always making itself known through sound and motion and the gradual infiltration of moisture. For men who spent months aboard, this became normal. The constant creaking became background noise. The rolling motion became the expected state of existence. The smell of tar and salt air became simply the smell of home. The ship's structure dictated how men moved through their day. Narrow companionways connected different levels. Steep ladders provided the only way up or down. In rough weather, simply walking across a tilting deck required effort and attention. Every movement had to account for the ship's motion. Storage and organisation followed strict patterns. Everything had its designated place. Loose items could become dangerous projectiles when the ship rolled. Barrels were lashed down, tools were secured. Even personal belongings had to be carefully stowed to prevent them from sliding across the deck. The wooden construction also meant constant maintenance. Seams needed recaulking, planks needed replacement when they rotted. Tar needed regular application to maintain waterproofing. This work never ended. Sailors spent their days maintaining the structure that had sheltered them, fighting against the gradual deterioration that saltwater caused. In winter, the wooden world became colder. The timber absorbed the temperature of the surrounding air and the water. Hull planks below the waterline stayed perpetually cold, chilled by the direct contact with icy seas. This cold radiated inward, making the interior spaces progressively colder as winter deepened. There was no insulation in the modern sense. The ship's thick wooden hull provided some barrier against outside temperatures, but it also conducted cold effectively. The result was an interior environment that tracked closely with outside conditions, offering shelter from wind and spray but little defense against cold itself. For pirates, this wooden world was often more cramped. Pirate vessels were frequently smaller ships, either purpose-built sloops or captured merchant vessels. These had less interior space than naval warships. Crews had to make do with tighter quarters and fewer amenities, but whether naval sailor or pirate, the fundamental reality was the same. The wooden ship was everything. It moved constantly. It smelled of tar and hemp and salt. It creaked and groaned with the sea's motion. And at night, when men tried to sleep, it offered shelter but never warmth. This was the world they inhabited. A floating structure of timber and rope carrying them across winter seas toward destinations weeks or months away. Understanding this environment, its limitations, its rhythms, its constant presence, is essential to understanding how sleep was possible within it. The ship provided walls and a roof. It kept men dry mostly. It gave them space to work and rest. But it could not and would not provide heat. That fundamental limitation shaped everything else that followed. Fire was forbidden aboard wooden ships. This was not a suggestion or a guideline. It was absolute law, enforced with the severity reserved for rules that determined survival. The reason was simple. Everything aboard a sailing ship could burn. The hull itself was wood, sealed with flammable pitch and tar. The deck planking was pine, dried and weathered. The masts and spars were timber. Miles of hemp rope ran through the rigging. Canvas sails hung ready to catch wind. Below deck, provisions included barrels of alcohol and lamp oil. On warships, powder magazines held tons of gunpowder. A single uncontrolled flame could destroy the entire vessel within minutes. Historical records show that Dutch warships were more frequently lost to fire and explosion than to enemy action. Fire was the greatest threat a wooden ship faced. The danger started with materials. Tar and pitch, used to waterproof seams and preserve rope, were highly flammable. These substances covered nearly every surface. They soaked into the wood. They coated the rigging. A spark landing on tarred rope could ignite immediately. Hemp rope, another combustible material, was present in massive quantities. The running rigging that controlled the sails required constant adjustment and replacement. The standing rigging that supported the masts had to withstand enormous tension. All of it would burn readily if exposed to flame. Canvas sails, though sometimes treated with preservatives, were also vulnerable. Hanging in the open air, they dried quickly. A spark drifting upward from an improperly secured lantern could set them alight. Below deck, the concentration of flammable materials increased. Storage holds contained spare rope, spare canvas, and wooden barrels. Many of these barrels held alcohol, rum for the crew, wine or spirits for officers. Lamp oil, used for the few lights permitted, added another combustible element. The powder magazine represented the ultimate danger. Warships carried gunpowder in quantities measured in tons. This powder was stored in a dedicated space, usually deep in the hull, surrounded by protective barriers. But if fire reached it, the resulting explosion would obliterate the ship. Given these vulnerabilities, fire prevention became the organizing principle of shipboard life. Open flames were permitted only in specific controlled circumstances. The galley stove used for cooking was the main exception. This stove was located on deck or in a specially designed galley with stone or brick construction around it. Even so, it was extinguished entirely during storms or heavy weather. During bad weather, the prohibition became total. When seas rose and the ship began to pitch violently, no fires of any kind were allowed. The galley stove went cold, lanterns were extinguished. The crew ate cold rations, ship's biscuits, salt meat, whatever could be consumed without heating. This timing was particularly difficult. Storms brought cold, wind-driven rain or spray. The crew worked constantly to manage sails and keep the ship on course. Physical exertion in cold, wet conditions drained body heat rapidly. Yet precisely when hot food would provide the most benefit, it became impossible to prepare. Lighting below deck was strictly regulated. On Spanish vessels, for instance, only specific personnel were authorized to carry lanterns. The dispenser, responsible for distributing food and medicine, could carry a lit lantern while moving through the lower decks. Everyone else relied on whatever light filtered down from above or from the dispenser's lantern. This created a dark environment. During the day, some light came through hatches and gun ports. At night, the lower decks were nearly black. Men learned to navigate by touch and memory, feeling their way along familiar passages. The restriction on light meant restriction on warmth. Lanterns produced small amounts of heat along with their light. But even this minimal warmth was denied to most of the crew. The cold remained unbroken. The hierarchy aboard ship extended to thermal comfort. Officers with their private cabins enjoyed certain privileges. A senior officer might be permitted a small brazier in his cabin under specific circumstances. Junior officers had fixed bunks in spaces slightly removed from the coldest areas of the hull. Common sailors had no such advantages. They slept on the gun decks, surrounded by cold iron cannons and cold wooden hull. The spaces where they hung their hammocks were the same spaces most vulnerable to condensation and dampness from the hull itself. This thermal hierarchy was not based on cruelty but on practicality and naval tradition. Officers needed to be functional and alert to make navigational and tactical decisions. There, comfort served a purpose within the ship's operation. Common sailors, though essential to the ship's functioning, were numerous enough that individual comfort was subordinated to collective safety. The complete absence of heat created a thermal deficit that could never be overcome. Unlike life on land, where even the poorest dwelling might have a hearth or stove, the ship offered no central source of warmth. Men could not gather around a fire. They could not warm their hands. They could not dry their clothes effectively. This deficit defined winter aboard ship. The outside temperature dropped, sometimes well below freezing. The ship's wooden structure absorbed this cold. The interior temperature tracked the exterior. There was no mechanism to raise it. Some research into fire safety aboard wooden ships exists, but remarkably little formal documentation survives from before the mid-1800s. This suggests that fire prevention was treated as common knowledge, passed through naval tradition rather than written doctrine. The rules were understood and followed because everyone recognized the consequences of failure. Violations of fire regulations were punished severely. A sailor found with an unauthorized flame could face flogging or worse. The entire crew's survival depended on absolute compliance with these rules. There was no room for individual judgment or special exceptions. The result was a life conducted in permanent cold. No matter how low the temperature dropped, no fire would be lit to counter it. No matter how damp the air became, no stove would dry it. The prohibition was total, and the consequences were accepted as the price of survival in the wooden world. This was the fundamental constraint that shaped everything else. Heat could not be generated. It could only be conserved through other means, through insulation, through proximity, through careful use of materials that retained warmth even in damp conditions. The law of fire made these strategies not optional, but essential. Understanding this prohibition helps explain why sailors developed the specific methods they did for surviving winter nights. They were not choosing among various options for staying warm. They were working within an absolute limitation, finding the only solutions possible when the most obvious source of warmth was permanently forbidden. The prohibition of fire created a state that could never be corrected. The ship's interior was always colder than the human body needed for comfort. This gap between need and reality was the thermal deficit, a permanent condition that defined life aboard ship in winter. Cold entered the ship from multiple directions. The most direct path was through the hull itself. Below the waterline, thick oak planks were in constant contact with seawater. In winter, this water could be barely above freezing. The wood absorbed this cold and conducted it inward. Hull timbers were substantial, often 8 to 12 inches thick on warships. This thickness provided structural strength but also created a massive heat sink. The wood's temperature equilibrated with the surrounding water, creating a cold surface that radiated chill into the interior spaces. Above the waterline, the hull was still exposed to cold air. Wind temperature in northern waters during winter could drop well below freezing. This air chilled the upper planks just as seawater chilled the lower ones. The result was a hull that was cold throughout its entire surface. The deck above provided some shelter from wind and precipitation, but offered no thermal insulation. Men working on deck were exposed to the full force of winter weather. Those below deck were spared the wind, but still surrounded by cold surfaces. Air temperature inside the ship tracked closely with outside conditions. There was no heating system to create a temperature differential. On a night when the outside air dropped to freezing, the interior spaces dropped nearly as low. The wooden hull moderated temperature changes slightly, preventing the most extreme fluctuations, but it could not raise the baseline temperature. This meant that sailors experienced a narrow range of cold. On the coldest nights, the lower decks might be slightly warmer than the open deck above, perhaps a few degrees. This small difference mattered, but it did not transform the experience. Cold remained cold. The metal components aboard ship intensified the problem. Iron cannons positioned along the gun decks became extremely cold. Metal conducts heat efficiently, meaning these guns quickly reached the same temperature as the surrounding air. Touching an iron cannon on a winter night could be painful. Other metal objects, hinges, fastenings, tools, presented the same issue. The ship was built primarily of wood and rope, but metal appeared throughout. Each piece became another cold surface, drawing heat away from anything that touched it. The absence of internal heat sources meant that body heat was the only warmth available. Human bodies generate heat through metabolic processes. At rest, an adult produces roughly the same heat as a 100-watt light bulb. But this heat is only useful if it can be retained and not immediately lost to the surrounding environment. Heat loss occurs through several mechanisms. Conduction transfers heat directly from a warm body to a cooler surface. Sleeping on a cold wooden deck would drain heat rapidly through this process. Convection carries heat away through air movement. Cold air circulating around a body removes warmth continuously. Radiation sends heat outwards to colder surfaces. A warm body radiates heat toward the cold hull timbers around it. Sailors had to minimize all three forms of heat loss simultaneously. This required specific strategies for insulation and positioning. The hammock addressed one form of heat loss by eliminating direct contact with the cold deck. Suspended in air, the hammock prevented conductive heat loss through the floor. This was a significant advantage. Sleeping directly on the deck would have drained body heat so rapidly that survival would have been difficult. But suspension created its own problem. Cold air could circulate freely beneath the suspended sleeper. This convective heat loss had to be blocked by insulation below the body. Without something to trap air and prevent circulation, the hammock offered only partial protection. The ship's constant motion complicated heat retention. Air did not remain still. As the vessel rolled and pitched, air currents moved through the lower decks. These currents carried away warmth and brought fresh cold air into contact with any exposed skin or inadequately insulated surfaces. Dampness magnified every form of heat loss. Water conducts heat far more effectively than air. When clothing or bedding became damp, and in the humid environment of the ship, they were always at least slightly damp, they lost much of their insulating value. Wet fabric clinging to skin drained body heat through both conduction and evaporation. The evaporative effect was particularly draining. As moisture evaporated from damp fabric, it absorbed heat from the surroundings. This cooling effect worked constantly, even when the dampness was not enough to make fabric feel wet to the touch. The high humidity below deck ensured that this process never fully stopped. Breathing added to the moisture load. Each exhaled breath contained water vapor. In the crowded lower decks, dozens of men breathing created a constant source of humidity. This moisture had nowhere to go when hatches were closed. It saturated the air and condensed on cold surfaces. The ship's structure amplified the condensation problem. Cold hull timbers provided an ideal surface for water vapor to condense upon. Warm, humid air from breathing and sweating rose until it contacted the cold wood. There it condensed into droplets that slowly ran down the hull or dripped onto whatever lay below. This condensation kept everything damp. Hammocks absorbed moisture from the air. Blankets grew heavy with condensed water vapour. Clothing never fully dried. The perpetual dampness was as much an enemy as the cold itself, and the two worked together to drain warmth from the body. Caloric intake affected the body's ability to generate heat. Food provides the fuel for metabolic heat production. But during storms, when conditions were coldest and most demanding, the crew was restricted to cold rations. Ship's biscuit and salt meat provided calories but required no cooking. These cold meals offered no immediate warmth and less satisfaction than hot food. The psychological impact of cold food during cold weather should not be underestimated. A hot meal provides not just calories but also immediate warmth in the stomach, a temporary comfort that helps morale. Denied this, sailors faced both physical and psychological challenges during the worst weather. Physical exertion generated additional body heat. Sailors working on deck in winter produced enough metabolic heat to partially offset the cold, at least while moving. But this exertion came at a cost. Sweating during work left clothing damp, which then drained heat more effectively when the work stopped. Rest periods were therefore especially vulnerable. After exertion, a sailor would descend to the lower decks with damp clothing and depleted energy. His body needed to recover, but recovery required rest. Rest meant lower metabolic heat production. The thermal deficit was most keenly felt during these periods of attempted sleep. The deficit could not be eliminated. It could only be managed through careful attention to insulation and minimizing heat loss. Every strategy sailors employed was defensive, blocking heat from escaping rather than generating new warmth. This fundamental reality shaped their approach to sleep. They could not make their environment warm. They could only make it slightly less cold. The difference between success and failure was measured in degrees, small margins that separated tolerable discomfort from genuine danger. The thermal deficit was the constant background condition of winter at sea. It influenced every decision about clothing, bedding, and sleeping position. It determined who slept where and how tightly packed the crew needed to be. It was the organizing principle around which all other adaptations developed. Understanding this deficit, its sources, its mechanisms, its persistence, is essential to understanding why sailors made the specific choices they did. They were not seeking comfort. They were seeking survival within margins that allowed no error and offered no reprieve. Water was everywhere aboard a wooden ship, not as catastrophic flooding, but as persistent, pervasive moisture that could never be fully eliminated. This dampness arose from multiple sources and created conditions that made cold more penetrating and rest more difficult. The hull itself was the primary source. No wooden vessel achieved perfect watertightness. Shipwrights sealed seams between the planks using a process called caulking. Workers drove oakum, loose hemp fibres, into the gaps between planks using specialised tools. This oakum was then sealed with tar or pitch, creating a barrier against water. When fresh, this caulking worked reasonably well. But ships flexed constantly, wood swelled and shrank with changes in moisture and temperature. The forces of the sea stressed every joint and seam. Over time, caulking loosened. Tar cracked, small gaps opened between planks. Water found these gaps. At first, the seepage was minor, a slow weeping along seams rather than active leaking. But even this small amount of water accumulated. In calm seas, the leakage was minimal. During storms, when waves crashed against the hull and water pressure increased, the seepage accelerated. This water collected at the lowest point of the ship, the bilge. This space beneath the lowest deck served as a catch basin for all water that entered the hull. It was never meant to be dry. The bilge's existence acknowledged that some water ingress was inevitable. Bilge water was not clean. It mixed with debris that fell through the deck grating. Spilled provisions added organic matter. On longer voyages, the accumulation of waste contributed to the mixture. The result was a putrid liquid that had to be pumped out regularly. Bilge pumps were manual devices requiring significant effort to operate. The basic design used a plunger mechanism. Sailors pushed a long handle up and down, creating suction that drew water upward through a pipe. The water was then expelled over the side. This pumping was constant work. On some ships, the pumps operated in shifts throughout the day. The sound they produced, a rhythmic clanking and creaking, became part of the ship's background noise. If debris lodged in the pump mechanism, the sound changed to a grinding or squealing that signalled trouble. The bilge pumps were considered the ship's last defence against sinking. As long as the pumps could remove water faster than it entered, the ship remained afloat. But if the pumps failed or if damage allowed water to enter too rapidly, the ship was in immediate danger. The constant presence of bilge water created a perpetual source of moisture in the air. Even when the water was pumped down to minimal levels, residual dampness remained. This moisture evaporated upward, saturating the air in the lower decks. The smell of the bilge was distinctive and unavoidable. Historical accounts describe it as terrifying, a compound of decay, waste and stagnant water. The odour permeated everything, clothing absorbed it, hammocks took on the scent. The wood itself became impregnated with the smell over time. Ventilation might have reduced this odour, but ventilation was limited. Fresh air entered primarily through hatches and gun ports. In calm weather, these could remain open, allowing some air circulation. But when weather turned foul, everything was sealed shut. Closed hatches trapped the bilge smell below deck. They also trapped the moisture. With nowhere for humid air to escape, it saturated every available surface. This created ideal conditions for mould and fungal growth. Moulds and other growths appeared on wood, fabric and stored provisions. These organisms thrived in the dark, damp environment. They colonised ropes, spread across canvas, and attacked any organic material. The growth added its own musty odour to the existing smell. Beyond the bilge, condensation created another source of moisture. The mechanism was simple but relentless. Warm air holds more moisture than cold air. When warm, humid air contacts a cold surface, water vapour condenses into liquid. The hull timbers below the waterline remained cold year-round. In winter, they became extremely cold. The air inside the ship, warmed slightly by the crew's body heat and breathing, carried moisture. When this air contacted the cold hull, condensation formed. The process was continuous. As long as the hull remained cold and the air contained moisture, condensation would occur. Water droplets formed on the inner surface of the planks. These droplets ran down the hull or simply hung there, gradually soaking into the wood. Anything near the hull became damp from this condensation. Hammocks hung close to the hull timbers, absorbed moisture from the air, and from direct contact with condensation running down the wood. Blankets stored near the hull grew heavy with accumulated dampness. The ship's cargo contributed additional moisture and odours. Barrels of salted meat or fish leaked brine. Containers of lamp oil could seep. Some ships carried livestock, and the waste from animals added to the unsanitary conditions. Even neutral cargo like grain or flour could become damp and begin to mildew. The combination of these factors created what can only be described as a damp atmosphere. The air itself felt heavy. It coated the lungs with each breath. Salt from sea spray mixed with the moisture, leaving a faint metallic tang on the tongue. Clothing never dried completely. Sailors might hang wet garments in the rigging during fair weather, and the sun and wind would remove surface moisture. But truly dry fabric was rare. Within hours of being brought below deck, the humidity would restore at least some dampness. Wool's advantage became clear in this environment. Unlike cotton or linen, wool retains much of its insulating capacity even when damp. The fiber's structure traps air in small pockets that remain somewhat effective even when moisture is present. This made wool essential for survival in the ship's permanently humid conditions. Leather presented special problems. Shoes, belts, and other leather items absorbed moisture readily. Once wet, leather took days to dry properly. In the ship's humid environment, complete drying was nearly impossible. Damp leather became stiff and uncomfortable. It also deteriorated more rapidly than dry leather would. The dampness affected health beyond mere discomfort. Prolonged exposure to cold, damp conditions contributed to respiratory ailments. The combination of poor ventilation and high humidity created conditions favourable to disease transmission. Historical records show that sailors suffered high rates of illness, and the ship's atmosphere was certainly a contributing factor. Yet sailors had to accept these conditions. The dampness was structural, built into the very nature of wooden ships on the ocean. It could be minimised through pumping and occasional ventilation, but it could never be eliminated. Personal hygiene became difficult in this environment. Washing clothes required fresh water, which was rationed for drinking and cooking. Even when clothes could be washed, drying them was nearly impossible. Most sailors wore the same garments for extended periods, allowing sweat and dirt to accumulate. The sensory reality of the lower decks was overwhelming for anyone unaccustomed to it. The smell at first, that complex mixture of bilge, tar, unwashed bodies and confined air. Then came the feel of dampness on every surface. Wood was slightly slick with moisture. Metal was cold and wet to the touch. Fabric felt heavy and never quite dry. Sound took on particular qualities in the damp air. Voices seemed muffled. The creaking of the hull was deeper, more resonant. Water sounds came through clearly, the slap of waves against planks, the gurgle of bilge water shifting with the ship's motion, the steady clank of the pumps. This environment was what sailors descended into each night when they sought rest. The cold was one challenge, the dampness was another, equally significant. Together, they created conditions that made sleep both desperately needed and difficult to achieve. The dampness could not be avoided or denied. It was simply there, part of the wooden world's fundamental nature. Sailors learned to function within it, to sleep despite it, to maintain their equipment and themselves in conditions that would deteriorate anything left unattended. The anatomy of this dampness, its sources in hull seepage and condensation, its concentration in the bilge, its effects on air quality and material condition, formed the background against which all other adaptations had to function. Understanding it reveals why certain choices about bedding and clothing were not optional but necessary. The hammock was not a European invention. Sailors observed it in the Caribbean, among native populations who had developed it over generations. Columbus noted these suspended beds during his voyages. The design was immediately recognised as superior to any sleeping arrangement then used aboard European ships. Before hammocks became standard equipment, sailors slept wherever space allowed. Some found spots on deck, between coils of rope or against the masts. Others slept below on the deck itself or among cargo. These arrangements were uncomfortable and unsanitary. They provided no protection from shifting cargo or deck filth. The British Royal Navy formally adopted hammocks in 1597. The decision was practical rather than focused on comfort. Hammocks solved multiple problems that had no other effective solution. The first advantage was stability. A ship at sea moves constantly. It rolls from side to side with the waves. It pitches forward and back. In rough weather, these movements can be violent. A person sleeping on a fixed surface gets thrown about. Sleep becomes nearly impossible. The hammock suspension changes this dynamic. The canvas sling hangs from ropes attached to beams above. As the ship rolls, the hammock swings. Its pendulum motion counteracts much of the ship's movement. The sleeper remains relatively stable even when the deck tilts sharply. This principle is simple physics. The hammock's centre of gravity stays relatively constant while the mounting points move with the ship. The result is that the sleeping surface stays more level than any fixed bed would. The ship can pitch violently while the hammock sways gently. The design also prevented ejection during rough seas. The canvas wrapped around the sleeper's body in a way that created natural containment. Historical descriptions compare it to a cocoon. Even in severe rolling, a sailor in a properly hung hammock would swing and sway but not fall out. The second major advantage was elevation. The hammock raised the sleeper above the deck surface. This separation was critical for sanitation and thermal comfort. Deck surfaces accumulated filth. Despite efforts to maintain cleanliness, various debris collected on the wooden planking. In the bilge areas, this included water contaminated with waste and decay. Sleeping directly on such surfaces exposed sailors to disease and discomfort. Elevation above the deck created a barrier against this contamination. The hammock kept the sleeper separated from deck moisture and filth. Air circulated beneath, providing some ventilation and preventing direct contact with the worst of the deck's condition. This elevation also separated the sleeper from the coldest zone. Heat rises, so the air near the deck was typically coldest. Being suspended even a few feet higher placed the sleeper in slightly warmer air. The difference was small but meaningful over a long winter night. The third advantage was efficiency of space. Naval warships required large crews. Sailing the ship needed relatively few men, but operating the guns in battle required many more. A 74-gun ship of the line might carry over 600 men. All of these had to sleep somewhere. Fixed bunks would have occupied permanent floor space. On gun decks, This space was needed for operating the cannons. The hammock solved this by being temporary. Each morning, sailors rolled up their hammocks and stowed them. The gun deck transformed instantly from dormitory to battle station. This transformation was part of the daily routine. Hammocks came down at a specified time in the morning. They were rolled tightly and secured with rope. The rolled hammocks were then stored in netting along the ship's rail, or in designated storage areas. This cleared the deck completely for the day's work. In the evening, hammocks went back up. Each sailor had an assigned number indicating where his hammock should hang. The positions were specified to maximise use of available space while allowing some circulation room between hammocks. The density of hammock placement varied by ship and crew size, but it was generally quite tight. Hammocks might hang with only inches between them. This crowding created challenges for getting in and out, but it also contributed to warmth through proximity. The hammock's construction was straightforward. A rectangular piece of heavy canvas formed the bed surface. Ropes attached to grommets at each end connected to cleats or hooks on the beams above. Some hammocks had spreader bars at the ends to help maintain width, though many were simple canvas slings without rigid components. The canvas itself had to be durable. It supported the full weight of a sleeping man and had to endure constant stress from the ship's motion. Navy specifications called for tightly woven material strong enough to last through extended use. The length and width were standardised within naval services. This allowed for efficient stowing and ensured that hammocks fit properly in their designated spaces. A typical hammock was roughly 6 to 7 feet long and perhaps 3 feet wide when spread. Getting into a hammock required some technique. The suspended canvas was unstable. It wanted to rotate, potentially dumping an unwary occupant onto the deck. Sailors learned to enter from the side, keeping their weight low and centred until they were fully reclined. Once inside, the hammock's shape adapted to the body. The canvas curved around the sleeper, creating that cocoon effect. This wrapping provided some sense of security and helped retain body heat by reducing exposed surface area. The gentle swaying motion of the hammock had unexpected benefits. Modern research indicates that rhythmic rocking promotes faster sleep onset and deeper sleep. The mechanism involves the vestibular system. The motion provides input that the brain processes as soothing rather than alerting. Sailors would not have understood the neurological basis, but they experienced the effect. The hammock's gentle swing, driven by the ship's motion, helped them fall asleep despite the difficult conditions. What seemed like a hostile environment, a ship rolling in ocean swells, was partially transformed into a sleep aid through the hammock's design. The rocking was consistent, unlike the irregular jolts and bumps of sleeping on a fixed surface aboard a moving ship. The hammock's motion was smooth and predictable. This rhythmic quality made it easier to ignore and eventually to find restful. The hammock also had cultural significance. It was the sailor's personal space in an environment where privacy was nearly non-existent. His hammock and the small area around it represented the closest thing to private property. Naval regulations typically guaranteed each sailor the right to his hammock space, roughly 30 cubic feet. This space was small but defined. In the crowded, hierarchical world of the ship, having any guaranteed personal space mattered. The hammock was where a sailor kept his few possessions, where he could retreat from the demands of shipboard life, where he could rest without constant supervision. The hammock followed sailors through their careers and even beyond. It was common practice that if a sailor died at sea, his body would be sewn into his own hammock for burial. The canvas that had held him in sleep would hold him in death. This tradition underscored the hammock's intimate connection to a sailor's identity. For pirates, hammocks were equally essential, but perhaps more varied in quality. Without the Navy's standardized supply system, pirates relied on whatever they could acquire. Some hammocks were captured from merchant ships or naval vessels. Others might be improvised from available canvas. The quality varied, but the basic design remained the same. The adoption of the hammock represented a genuine technological improvement in maritime life. It addressed real problems with elegant simplicity. The suspended canvas sling required no complex mechanism or expensive materials, yet it provided stability, sanitation, and space efficiency that no previous sleeping arrangement could match. Understanding the hammock's function and advantages is essential to understanding how sleep was possible aboard ship. It was not merely a place to lie down, it was a carefully designed piece of equipment that transformed the ship's motion from obstacle into advantage. that provided essential separation from deck contamination, and that allowed efficient use of crowded spaces. The Canvas Cradle was where sailors spent roughly a third of their time at sea. It rocked them through countless nights. It protected them from the worst of the ship's motion and the deck's filth. It gave them a defined space in an environment where everything else was shared and temporary. When combined with appropriate bedding and insulation, the hammock became the foundation of the sailors' strategy for surviving winter nights. But the hammock alone was not sufficient. It provided the platform, but warmth had to come from other sources, from the materials wrapped around the body, and from the proximity of other sleepers sharing the same cold, damp space. The hammock's motion was not random. It followed patterns determined by the sea's state and the ship's response. Understanding these patterns helps explain how sailors could sleep in an environment that seemed designed to prevent rest. In calm conditions, the hammock's movement was minimal. The ship drifted gently, responding to small swells. The hammock swung slowly, almost imperceptibly. This motion was barely noticeable, just enough to provide that rhythmic input without being disruptive. The gentle sway in calm seas had a hypnotic quality. The period of oscillation was slow and regular. The hammock would swing a few inches one way, pause, then return. This repetition created a predictable rhythm that the body could anticipate and relax into. The sound accompanying calm sea motion was equally soothing. Water lapped softly against the hull planks. The sound came through the wood as a gentle percussion, rhythmic slapping that matched the hammock's slow swing. Together, motion and sound created a sensory environment conducive to rest. Sailors described this as pleasant. The combination of gentle rocking and soft water sounds was, for many, easier to sleep through than complete stillness would have been. The human vestibular system, which detects motion, appears to respond positively to consistent, gentle movement. As sea conditions changed, the hammock's motion intensified. Moderate swells created more pronounced rolling. The ship tilted further with each wave. The hammock responded by swinging through a wider arc. This increased motion remained predictable. The hammock still moved with the ship's rhythm, but the amplitude grew. A swing that was inches in calm seas might become feet in moderate conditions, yet because the motion stayed rhythmic, it remained manageable for sleep. The canvas itself contributed to the experience. As the hammock swung, the fabric flexed and adjusted. This created small pressure changes against the body, subtle shifts that provided feedback about the hammock's position and movement. The body learned to read these signals and make small adjustments to stay centered. In rougher seas, the motion became more challenging. The ship pitched violently. Waves struck the hull with force. The hammock swung through larger arcs and with greater speed. Under these conditions, sleep became more difficult but not impossible. The hammock's cocoon shape became especially important in rough weather. The canvas wrapped tightly around the sleeper, creating physical boundaries that prevented being thrown out. Even when the hammock swung wildly, the sleeper remained contained within the fabric's embrace. Sailors learned to position themselves to maximize stability. Lying diagonally across the hammock, rather than along its length, reduced the tendency to rotate. This diagonal position spread the body's weight more evenly and created a lower centre of gravity. The body's position also affected heat retention. Lying diagonal allowed the canvas to wrap more completely around the sleeper. This created better insulation by reducing exposed surface area. The practical sleeping position was also the thermally efficient one. Experienced sailors could sleep through conditions that would seem impossible to landsmen. Their bodies adapted to the motion. The constant swaying became the expected state. Complete stillness, experienced ashore, actually felt strange and could make sleep more difficult initially. This adaptation developed over time. New sailors often struggled with the hammock's motion for their first weeks at sea. Seasickness complicated the early experience, but gradually the body's equilibrium adjusted. The inner ear learned to interpret the ship's motion as normal rather than alarming. The hammock's suspension system itself required maintenance. The rope supporting it stretched and frayed with use. Regular inspection was necessary to prevent failure. A broken rope could drop a sleeping sailor onto the deck below, an unpleasant awakening and potential injury. Navy regulations specified the quality and thickness of hammock ropes. These had to support not just the sleeper's weight, but also the dynamic forces created by the ship's motion. A hammock swinging through a wide arc generated significant tension in its supporting ropes. The attachment's points were equally critical. Hammocks hung from beams or hooks set into the deck beams above. These attachment points had to be solid and properly positioned. Spacing between hooks determined how closely hammocks could be hung. The height of suspension was standardized within limits. Too high and getting in became difficult. Too low and the hammock might touch the deck when occupied. The typical height placed the hammock's empty position roughly waist-high, dropping to perhaps knee-high when a man lay in it. This positioning created layers of sleeping sailors. In spaces where headroom allowed, hammocks might be hung at different heights, creating tiers. This maximised use of vertical space but required careful coordination to avoid collisions between different levels. The daily ritual of hanging and stowing hammocks created its own rhythm. Morning stowage was mandatory and happened at a specified time. Men rolled their hammocks tightly, securing them with rope in a standardized bundle. This bundle had to meet size requirements. Loose or poorly rolled hammocks were unacceptable. The rolled hammocks served additional purposes. When stored in netting along the ship's rail, they provided a barrier against small arms fire during battle. The tightly packed canvas could stop musket balls, offering some protection to crew on deck. This defensive use gave hammock stowage additional importance. Evening hammock hanging followed its own routine. Men retrieved their rolled hammocks from storage. They carried them to their assigned positions on the gun deck. The hammock was unrolled and attached to its designated hooks. Within minutes, the deck transformed from open workspace to crowded sleeping quarters. This transformation happened simultaneously for dozens of men. The process created a brief period of activity and noise as hammocks went up and sailors prepared for rest. Then came the settling, men climbing into their hammocks, arranging their bedding, finding comfortable positions. The sound environment changed with the hammocks in place. The canvas absorbed some sound, muffling voices and movement. The forest of suspended hammocks broke up the sound waves, creating a different acoustic space than the empty gun deck had. But other sounds emerged. The creaking of ropes under tension added to the ship's voice. Each hammock's movement created small sounds. Canvas shifting, ropes rubbing against attachment points. Multiplied across dozens of hammocks, these created a subtle background noise. The collective swaying of many hammocks created visual patterns. In the dim light of the gun deck, rows of hammocks swung in near unison, all responding to the same ship motion. The sight had an almost hypnotic quality, regular, rhythmic, endless. For the man lying in his hammock, the world narrowed to immediate sensations. The canvas pressing against his back and sides, the gentle sway, the sounds of the ship and sea, the presence of other sleepers, nearby, the cold air on his kafta, the weight of whatever bedding covered him. The hammock isolated each sleeper while keeping him connected to the collective. The canvas created a personal space, but that space moved with the same rhythm as every other hammock. Individual experience was subsumed into shared experience, everyone rocking together, everyone responding to the same forces. This shared rhythm may have contributed to sleep's possibility. Humans are social creatures. The presence of others engaged in the same activity, rest, can be reassuring. Knowing that everyone around you is also trying to sleep, all rocking in the same motion, creates a collective settling that individual effort alone might not achieve. The hammock's motion also masked other disturbances. Small noises and movements that might wake a sleeper on a still bed were absorbed into the constant gentle motion. The rocking provided enough sensory input that minor variations barely registered. Physiologically, the rocking appears to influence brain activity during sleep. Research suggests that gentle motion enhances certain sleep rhythms, particularly the slow oscillations associated with deep sleep. These slow waves help consolidate memories and promote physical restoration. Sailors experienced this without understanding the mechanism. They knew that the hammock's motion, once adapted to, actually helped them sleep. The ship's movement was not an obstacle to overcome, but a resource to harness. The boundary between waking and sleeping became blurred in the hammock. The transition was gradual. The rocking continued whether the sailor was awake or asleep. There was no sharp moment of lying down in stillness. Instead, consciousness faded while the motion persisted. This may have made sleep onset easier. Rather than requiring the body to become completely still before sleep could come, the hammock allowed sleep to arrive while movement continued. The motion became incorporated into the sleeping state rather than preventing it. Dreams in a hammock sometimes incorporated the ship's motion. Sailors reported dreams of flying or floating that likely reflected the vestibular input they continued receiving while asleep. The brain processed the hammock's swing into dream imagery, integrating the physical reality into sleeping consciousness. Morning awakening followed a similar pattern. Consciousness returned gradually, emerging from sleep while the rocking continued. There was no jarring transition from stillness to motion. The world was already moving when awareness returned. The hammock's rhythm thus framed the entire sleep experience. It provided the physical context from evening hanging through night's deepest sleep to morning awakening. Its motion was the constant background against which rest occurred, sometimes gentle, sometimes vigorous, but always present. Understanding this rhythm reveals how the hammock was more than passive equipment. It actively participated in the sleep process through its motion. The ship's movement, transmitted through rope and canvas, became part of the mechanism that allowed exhausted sailors to find rest despite the cold, despite the damp, despite all the other challenges of the wooden world. The Canvas Cradle rocked on. Descending below deck meant entering a different world. The transition was physical and sensory. Light diminished, temperature dropped, the smell changed, sound became more complex. This was where common sailors spent their nights. The main sleeping space was the gun deck. On warships, this deck held the vessel's primary armament, rows of cannons positioned along both sides. Between the guns, in the spaces needed to operate them during battle, sailors hung their hammocks at night. The gun deck was not designed for sleeping, its purpose was combat. The cannons defined the space. They sat on wooden carriages secured with heavy rope. Each gun required several feet of clearance for its crew to load and fire it. This operational space became sleeping space when battle was not imminent. The deck's dimensions were constrained by the ship's hull. Headroom was limited. A tall man could not stand fully upright in many areas. The deck beams overhead were massive timbers supporting the deck above. These beams provided the attachment points for hammocks, but also created a low ceiling. Moving through the gun deck required awareness. In darkness or dim light, the beams could strike an unwary head. The cannons themselves presented obstacles. Their bulk had to be navigated around. The rope securing them created trip hazards. During the day, the gun deck was relatively open. Hatches above allowed light to filter down. Gun ports could be opened in calm weather, admitting both light and fresh air. The space felt less oppressive when these openings were available, but at night or in foul weather, everything closed. Hatches were battened down to prevent water ingress. Gun ports were sealed for the same reason. The gun deck became an enclosed space with minimal light and no direct ventilation. The darkness was profound. In fair weather with hatches open, some ambient light from the moon or stars might provide faint illumination. But in storms or on moonless nights, the darkness was nearly complete. Men navigated by the memory and touch. The few permitted lights provided minimal illumination. A lantern carried by authorized personnel created a small sphere of visibility. Beyond that sphere, darkness prevailed. Sailors learned to move confidently in this darkness, knowing the space through repetition rather than sight. The temperature on the gun deck tracked the outside air, but with some moderation. The deck above provided insulation from direct wind. The hull around provided mass that tempered rapid temperature changes, but fundamentally the gun deck was as cold as the outside temperature minus a few degrees. In winter, this meant cold. The iron cannons absorbed the chill and radiated it into the surrounding space. The hull planks, especially near the waterline, were cold to the touch. The deck beams overhead were slightly warmer, but still well below body temperature. Air circulation was minimal when hatches were closed. What little circulation occurred came from the ship's motion and the temperature differentials between areas. Cold air settled low. Warmer air from the crew's bodies rose, but without active ventilation the air became stale. The stale air carried the accumulated smells of the ship. Bilge odour permeated upward from below. The smell of tar and pitch was always present. Unwashed bodies contributed their scent. Damp wool and canvas added musty notes. The combination was distinctive and, to new sailors, often overwhelming. But habituation occurred. The nose adapted. Smells that were initially strong faded into background awareness. Sailors living in this environment daily simply stopped noticing what they could not change. The smell became part of normal, something noticed only when absent. The gun deck's organisation was strict. Each sailor had attained an assigned hammock position marked by a number. These numbers corresponded to stations for other duties as well. A man's place in the ship's organisation determined where he slept. The spacing between hammock positions was standardised but tight. Regulations specified minimum distances, but these minimums were often the actual practice. Hammocks hung close enough that occupants could easily touch neighbours on either side. This proximity was necessary to accommodate the crew size. Naval warships carried large complements. Every available space had to be used efficiently. The result was a dense packing of sleeping bodies with minimal space between them. The density varied by location on the gun deck. Areas near hatches and companionways had to remain partially clear for movement. The spaces between guns could be packed more tightly. The most crowded sections might have hammocks nearly touching when occupied. Getting to one's hammock through this forest of suspended canvas required careful movement. Early in the evening, when many men were still awake and moving about, the passage was easier. Later, when most were already in their hammocks, navigating through required care to avoid disturbing sleepers, the hammocks themselves created a visual barrier. Rows of canvas obliterated sightlines across the deck. What had been an open space during the day became a maze of fabric walls at night. This created a strange sense of privacy through visual obstruction despite the physical proximity. Sound carried differently through the hanging hammocks. Voices were muffled. The canvas absorbed some frequencies and reflected others. Conversations could be heard but were less distinct than in the empty deck. This acoustic damping contributed to the gradual quieting as men settled for sleep. The gun deck's position within the ship meant it experienced the hull's movement fully. Unlike the captain's cabin, at the stern, which had more complex motion, the gun deck followed the ship's fundamental rolling and pitching. This motion was transmitted through the deck beams to the hammocks, creating that synchronized swaying. Water sounds came through the hull planks clearly. The gun deck was often at or near the waterline. The slap and rush of water against the outside of the hull was audible as though the sea was just beyond the wood, which it was. This proximity to the ocean was both reassuring and unsettling. In rough seas, the sounds intensified. Waves struck the hull with force. The impact transmitted as both sound, vibration through the wooden structure. These strikes were irregular and unpredictable, unlike the rhythmic motion of the hammocks. They could jar men partially awake before exhaustion pulled them back under. The creaking of the hull was constant. Wood worked against wood. The ship's structure flexed with each wave. Timbers groaned under stress. These sounds were deep and resonant, felt as much as heard. They formed the bass notes in the symphony of ship sounds. The deck beams contributed their own creaking as hammock weights stressed them. Each beam supported multiple hammocks. The combined weight, plus the dynamic forces from swaying, created significant loads. The wood responded with subtle sounds, creaks and small pops as fibres compressed and relaxed. The presence of the guns shaped the space in ways beyond the physical. These were weapons, tools of violence. They represented the ship's purpose and power. Sleeping among them was a daily reminder of the naval life's nature. Pirates, sleeping among captured guns, had a similar reminder of their profession. The guns required maintenance even when not in use. They had to be kept secure. The salt air corroded metal, requiring regular attention. Gun crews were responsible for their weapons' condition. This created a relationship between sailors and the guns they slept among. These were not just obstacles, but tools they might depend on. The gun deck's role changed with circumstances. During battle preparations, hammocks came down immediately. The space had to clear for action in minutes. This rapid transformation was practiced regularly. The sailor's sleeping space could become a combat station faster than any other area of the ship could change function. This dual purpose affected how sailors related to the space. It was never fully domestic. It was always potentially martial. The comfort of rest was borrowed from a space designed for violence. This tension was part of naval life's fundamental character. For pirates, gun decks were often smaller and more crowded. Pirate vessels were typically lighter, faster ships with fewer and lighter guns. But the basic pattern remained. sleeping among the weapons in spaces cleared twice daily, with the same constraints of light and ventilation. The lower decks also included areas below the gun deck. These were even darker and damper. Storage, holds, powder magazines, and the bilge itself occupied these spaces. Some crew members had duties that required working in these areas, but sleeping spaces were generally on the gun deck or occasionally on the deck above. The gun deck represented a middle ground, below the exposed weather deck, but above the truly deep dark spaces of the ship's lowest areas. It was cold, but not as damp as the bilge areas. It was dark, but not as completely lightless as the holds. It was crowded, but still functional. Living on the gun deck created a particular spatial awareness. Men knew the space through daily navigation in varying light conditions. They knew where beams were by the number of paces from landmarks. They knew their hammock position by counting from reference points. This mental map was essential for functioning in darkness. The gun deck was also where social life occurred. During the day when hammocks were down, men gathered here during off-watch hours. They talked, mended clothes, worked on small projects. The same space that held them in isolated hammocks at night held them in community during the day. This dual nature, communal workspace and individual sleeping space, defined the gun deck's character. It was never purely one thing. It shifted between functions according to the time of day and the ship's needs. Sailors lived in this shifting space, adapting to its transformations as naturally as they adapted to the sea's motion. Understanding the gun deck's physical reality, its constraints and characteristics, is essential to understanding the sleep experience. This was not a bedroom. It was not designed for comfort or rest. It was a functional space that sailors claimed for sleeping because no alternative existed. They made it work through routine, through adaptation, through the simple necessity of resting somewhere. The gun deck accepted their hammocks each evening and returned to its primary purpose each morning, an endless cycle that structured life aboard ship. Water was always present in sound, if not in sight. The ocean surrounded the ship. Its voice penetrated the wooden hull continuously. Understanding these water sounds helps explain the auditory environment in which sailors slept. The most immediate water sound was the sea against the hull. This contact between ocean and wood created sounds that varied with conditions. In calm seas, the sound was gentle, a soft lapping, or slapping, as small waves met the planks. This gentle percussion had a regular rhythm determined by the swell period. Small waves struck the hull in sequence. Each impact made a soft sound, a slap followed by a brief slosh as water settled. Then another wave arrived, creating the same sound. The repetition was hypnotic. The sound came from all directions. The ship's hull extended in a curve around the interior space. Water struck planks to port and starboard, forward and aft. The sounds overlapped but remained distinct enough to track individually if one paid attention. Sailors described the calm sea water sounds as pleasant. The gentle, repetitive nature provided auditory white noise that masked other, more irregular sounds. It created a background against which sleep could occur more easily than in complete silence. The pitch of these water sounds varied with location on the hull. Below the waterline, sounds were lower and more muffled. Water pressed constantly against submerged planks, creating a continuous low-frequency presence rather than distinct impacts. Above the waterline, sounds were sharper and more distinct. Wave tops struck with clearer percussion. Spray created higher frequency hissing as it scattered against wood. These sounds complemented the deeper tones from below. The ship's movement through water added another layer. When the vessel had way on, moving under sail, the bow pushed water aside. This created a rushing sound at the forward sections. Water parted, flowed along the hull, and closed behind the stern. The flow created a continuous susurration. At the stern, water's sound took on a different character. The wake behind the ship was turbulent. Water churned and mixed with air. This created a more complex sound, part gurgle, part rush, with irregular pops and splashes as bubbles collapsed. Inside the ship, these external water sounds transmitted through the wooden hull. The planks conducted sound effectively. What happened outside became audible inside, though muffled and changed by passing through several inches of oak. The quality of transmitted sound depended on the hull's construction. Thicker planks reduced higher frequencies more than lower ones. The result was that inside, sailors heard primarily the deeper water sounds, the fundamental tones rather than the bright, sharp impacts. The caulking between planks affected sound transmission. Well-maintained caulking created better acoustic sealing. Older or damaged caulking allowed more sound through. Ships varied in how much water noise penetrated their hulls based on maintenance condition. As weather deteriorated, water sounds changed dramatically. Moderate seas brought larger waves with more force. The gentle slapping became harder impacts. Waves struck the hull with enough force to create both sound and vibration felt through the structure. These larger wave impacts were less regular. Seas in building weather became chaotic. Waves arrived from multiple directions. Their timing was unpredictable. The resulting impacts created a more aggressive soundscape, crashes and booms rather than gentle percussion. In storms, water sounds dominated all others. Waves crashed against the hull with tremendous force. The sound was violent, sharp cracks followed by the roar of water streaming along the planks. These impacts transmitted as both audible sound and physical shock through the ship's structure. Spray added a constant hissing in rough weather. Wind tore tops off waves, carrying spray across the ship. This spray struck surfaces with a sound like thrown sand. The continuous hissing overlaid the deeper crashes of wave impacts. Green water, solid waves breaking over the deck created the loudest sounds. These were not spray but actual waves washing across the ship. The sound was a combination of impact and flow, often accompanied by the groaning of the ship's structure under the water's weight. Below deck during storms, the water sounds were overwhelming. Sleep became difficult not just from the ship's violent motion, but from the constant assault of noise. The hull creaked and groaned. Water crashed and roared. The combination created an environment where rest required profound exhaustion. Yet even in storms, the water sounds had patterns. The crashes came in sequences determined by wave intervals. Between the largest impacts were periods of lesser noise. The human ear could detect these patterns and, to some degree, anticipate the next large sound. Anticipation helped. A sound that is expected causes less startle response than one that is truly random. Sailors learned to read the rhythm of waves even in rough weather. Their bodies tensed before large impacts and relaxed slightly between them. The bilge water inside the ship created its own sounds. This water sloshed with the ship's motion. In calm seas, the sloshing was gentle. The water moved slowly from side to side, creating liquid sounds in the darkness below the lowest deck. In rough weather, bilge water moved violently. It surged with each roll. The sound was a rushing, sloshing noise that added to the external water sounds. Sailors could hear the bilge water's movement through the deck, a reminder that the sea was both outside and, to some degree, inside. The bilge pumps created distinct water sounds during operation. The pump drew water upward through pipes. The suction created gurgling sounds as water moved through the mechanism. When water discharged overboard, it created a splashing as it returned to the sea. These pump sounds were rhythmic, matching the manual operation's pace. The rhythm provided reassurance, evidence that the pumps were working, that water was being removed. When pump sounds stopped unexpectedly, it drew immediate attention. The silence meant either the bilge was dry, which was good, or the pumps had failed, which was potentially catastrophic. Leaks created their own distinctive sounds. A small leak through damaged caulking made a trickling or dripping sound. Larger leaks could create a steady stream sound. These noises were warning signs. Identifying a new water sound meant investigating to locate and assess the leak. Experienced sailors learned to distinguish water sounds. They could identify whether water was outside hitting the hull, inside in the bilge, coming through a leak, or being pumped out. This auditory awareness was part of their professional competence. Rain created different sounds than seawater. Rain on the deck above made a pattering noise that transmitted below. The sound was higher pitched than wave impacts, more uniform and continuous. Rain could be heard drumming on the deck while simultaneously running off and hitting the sea around the ship. In cold weather, ice created unique sounds. Spray could freeze on the rigging and deck. This ice made sharp, tinkling sounds when pieces broke off. Seawater thick with ice crystals made a different sound than liquid water, a grinding, crunching noise as the ship pushed through it. The combination of all these water sounds created an environment that was never quiet. Even in the calmest conditions, water was audible. The ship existed in sound contact with the ocean constantly. This aquatic presence was inescapable. For men trying to sleep, water sounds became part of the necessary soundscape. They could not be eliminated or avoided. Instead, they had to be accepted and integrated into rest. The sounds became familiar through repetition. What initially kept men awake eventually became the expected background. The predictable water sounds helped mask unpredictable ones. A sudden voice or footstep might wake a sleeper, but these irregular sounds were partially hidden in the continuous water noise. The ocean's voice provided acoustic cover that improved sleep quality despite its volume. There was also something fundamentally soothing about water sounds. Humans seem predisposed to find certain water sounds, streams, rain, waves, calming. This response may be evolutionary. The sounds signaled the presence of water, essential for survival. They became associated with safety and resources. Sailors sleeping to the sound of water against their ship's hull were, in a sense, returning to this ancient relationship. The sounds confirmed the ocean's presence. They verified the ship was afloat and moving. They provided constant feedback about the vessel's condition and the sea's state. The water's voice never stopped. From the moment a ship left port until it returned, the sound of the sea accompanied every hour. In sleep, this sound continued. It flowed through dreams, coloured the subconscious experience of rest, and persisted into waking. Understanding these water sounds reveals another dimension of the sleep environment. The auditory world inside the ship was dominated by the ocean's many voices, gentle or violent, predictable or chaotic, but always present. Sailors slept within this liquid soundscape, their rest framed by the element that both carried them and constantly threatened their wooden world. The bilge pump was as essential to the ship's survival as the masts or rudder. Its operation created a distinctive sound that became part of the ship's constant voice. Understanding this sound and what it represented helps complete the picture of life below deck. The bilge itself was the lowest internal space of the ship. It was where the hull's shape created a trough running the length of the vessel. Every ship collected water here. The water came from multiple sources: hull seepage, condensation, deck runoff finding its way below, and occasional larger incursions during heavy weather. This water had to be removed. If left to accumulate, it added weight that affected the ship's performance. More critically, rising bilge water could reach storage areas, damaging provisions and cargo. In extreme cases, unchecked water accumulation could make the ship founder. The bilge pump's fundamental design was simple. A pipe extended down into the bilge. Inside the pipe, a plunger moved up and down. The plunger had a leather seal that fit snugly against the pipe's interior. When pulled upward, the plunger created suction below it, drawing water up. When pushed downward, the water moved through a valve into the section above the plunger. This cycle repeated continuously during pumping. Each stroke lifted a volume of water higher. Eventually, the water reached the top of the pump and was expelled through a discharge pipe that carried it over the side. The mechanism required human power. Men worked the pump by pushing and pulling on a long handle. The handle's length provided leverage, but the work was still strenuous. Water is heavy. Lifting it from the bilge to deck level required significant effort. Pumping was organised into shifts. Men rotated through pump duty, working for set periods before being relieved. The rotation ensured the pumps could operate continuously when needed, without exhausting individual sailors. The sound the pump made depended on its condition and what was passing through it. A well-maintained pump operating smoothly made a rhythmic clanking. The handle mechanism created noise at each stroke. Metal parts moved against wood. The sounds were regular and predictable. The actual water movement made a secondary sound, a gurgling as it was drawn up the pipe. This sound varied with the flow rate. More water created louder gurgling. The combination of clanking mechanism and gurgling water created the pump's characteristic voice. When debris entered the pump, the sounds changed. Something caught in the mechanism created irregular noises, grinding, scraping, or squealing. These sounds meant trouble. Pumping had to stop while the blockage was cleared. This interruption was both annoying and potentially dangerous if the bilge was rising. Common debris included wood chips, rope fragments, and non-organic matter from provisions. Anything small enough to be drawn into the pump inlet could potentially clog it. Maintaining clear bilges required effort beyond pumping, regular cleaning to remove accumulating debris. The pump's rhythm became part of the ship's normal soundscape. During the day, when men were awake and working, pump sounds blended with other activity. But at night, when most work ceased and men tried to sleep, the pump's operation was more noticeable. The sound carried through the wooden structure. The pump mechanism was mounted to the ship's frame. Each stroke transmitted vibration through the timbers. This vibration carried the sound throughout the vessel. Men sleeping in hammocks could hear and sometimes feel the pump's operation. The regularity of the sound had a paradoxical effect. While initially it might seem disruptive, the consistent rhythm actually aided sleep. The human brain becomes remarkably good at filtering irregular, predictable sounds. After adaptation, the pump's clanking faded into background noise that did not prevent rest. What was more disturbing was when the pump sounds changed or stopped. A break in the rhythm drew attention. Men woke to silence where sound should be. This absence signalled either that the bilge was dry, good news, or that something had gone wrong, potentially bad news. Experienced sailors could assess the ship's condition partly by listening to the pumps. The rate of pumping indicated how much water was accumulating. Faster pumping meant more water entering. The need for continuous pumping versus intermittent operation told the crew about the hull's condition. In normal conditions, pumping might be needed only once or twice per day. The bilge would accumulate its usual seepage, and routine pumping removed it. This maintenance pumping was scheduled into the daily routine like other regular tasks. During storms, pumping became more urgent. Heavy seas increased hull stress. Seams that were tight in calm weather might weep more under pressure. Spray and rain found more ways below. The bilge level rose faster, requiring more frequent pumping. In these conditions, the pump ran almost continuously. Men rotated through pump duty more frequently. The sound of pumping became constant background noise, competing with the storm's other sounds. The rhythm might falter as exhausted men struggled with the work, but it had to continue. The pump's discharge created its own sound as water expelled overboard. The stream of dirty bilge water hit the sea with a splashing sound. This discharge was visible during the day, a stream of often coloured water showing that pumping was occurring. At night, only the sound confirmed it. The colour and smell of discharged bilge water provided information about conditions below. Clear or only slightly discoloured water was normal. Darkly coloured or foul-smelling discharge indicated problems, perhaps rotting cargo or other contamination. The pump brought samples of the bilge's condition up where they could be observed. Pump maintenance was continuous work. The leather seals wore out and needed replacement. The valves required adjustment. The mechanism needed greasing to reduce friction and wear. Neglected pumps became less efficient and eventually failed. A pump failure during a storm was a crisis. Without working pumps, water accumulated unchecked. The crew had to repair the pump while the bilge continued filling. Alternative pumping methods existed, buckets and chains of men, but these were far less efficient than functioning pumps. The sound of bucket brigades was distinct from pump operation. Instead of mechanical rhythm, there was the splash of buckets dipping, the slosh of water being passed hand to hand, and the splash as each bucket emptied over the side. This sound indicated either pump failure or water accumulation exceeding pump capacity, both serious situations. On some ships, multiple pumps existed. Naval vessels often had main pumps and auxiliary pumps. If one failed, others could take over. The sound of multiple pumps running simultaneously was louder but also reassuring. It meant the ship had redundancy in this critical system. Pirate ships, often operating with minimal maintenance and improvised repairs, experienced pump problems more frequently. Their pumps might make more noise due to worn components. The sound of a struggling, damaged pump grinding and squealing would have been common on the vessels that lacked proper upkeep. The bilge pump's voice was, in essence, the sound of the ship defending itself against the sea. Each stroke removed water that had penetrated the wooden hull. The rhythm represented ongoing resistance to the ocean's patient attempt to reclaim the vessel. For sailors sleeping below, this sound was reassurance. The clanking pump meant someone was working to keep the ship afloat. The regular rhythm meant the system was functioning. As long as the pump's voice continued its steady beat, the ship remained in equilibrium with the sea. Silence from the pumps could mean different things. In calm conditions after recent pumping, silence was expected and good. But unexpected silence during weather, or silence following irregular sounds, demanded investigation. The absence of the pump's voice changed from background normalcy to foreground concern. The psychological weight of the pump's sound should not be underestimated. It was a constant reminder of the ship's vulnerability. The need for continuous pumping demonstrated that the wooden hull was not perfectly watertight. The sea was always seeping in, always testing the barrier. Yet the sound also demonstrated human persistence. The pump's operation showed that the crew could maintain control. They could remove water faster than it entered. They could keep the ship functional despite its inherent porosity. The sound was both warning and reassurance, acknowledging danger while demonstrating competence. Living with the pump's voice required the same adaptation as living with the ship's motion or the water sounds. It became normalized through constant exposure. What would keep a landlubber awake through the night barely registered in a sailor's consciousness after a few weeks at sea. The bilge pump's rhythm joined the larger symphony of ship sounds, the creaking hull, the water against planks, the wind in rigging. Together, these created the auditory environment of life aboard. The pump was a critical voice in this ensemble, perhaps not the loudest, but certainly one of the most significant. Understanding the bilge pump and its sound completes another piece of the sleep environment's picture. Sailors rested to the accompaniment of this mechanical heartbeat, this rhythm of survival, this constant evidence that the wooden world required continuous effort to maintain. The pump's voice flowed through their sleep, unnoticed but essential, marking the hours with its steady, life-preserving beat. The ship itself was never silent. Its wooden structure responded to every force acting upon it with sound. These sounds formed a complex, ever-present symphony that sailors lived within. Understanding this auditory environment reveals another dimension of the experience of sleep at sea. The fundamental sound was creaking. Wood under stress makes characteristic noises as its fibers compress, bend, and rub against adjacent surfaces. A sailing ship was always under stress from multiple sources and therefore always creaking. The hull's shape and construction created stress patterns. The vessel curved in 3 dimensions. The bow and stern curved upward from the midship, the sides curved inward and outward, and the bottom curved in a complex shape designed to move efficiently through water. This 3-dimensional structure distributed forces unevenly. When a wave lifted the bow, the ship's forward section bent upward slightly. This bending put the deck timbers in tension and the keel in compression. The wood responded with groaning sounds as fibers stretched or compressed. When the wave passed and the bow dropped, the stresses reversed and new sounds emerged. The wavelength of ocean swells relative to the ship's length determined stress patterns. When the ship was supported by 2 wave crests simultaneously, one under the bow and one under the stern, the midship sagged slightly. This hogging stress created particular creaking sounds from the midship timbers. Conversely, when a wave crest was at midship with troughs at bow and stern, the hull arched slightly upward. This sagging stress produced different sounds as different parts of the structure were loaded. The ship's voice changed with its position on the wave. The connection points between structural members were particularly vocal. Massive timbers met and were held together by wooden pegs called tree nails and iron fastenings. These joints bore tremendous loads. As the ship flexed, the joints worked, wood sliding slightly against wood, metal stressing against both. These joint sounds were complex. A single joint might produce a sequence of sounds as the ship moved through its flex cycle. Initial movement created one tone. As pressure built, the pitch changed. When the stress released, yet another sound emerged. Multiply this by hundreds of joints throughout the structure, and the complexity becomes apparent. The deck beams contributed their own voices. These heavy timbers ran across the ship's width, supporting the deck planking above and often serving as attachment points for hammocks below. Each beam bore weight and flexed with ship's motion. When a wave caused the hull to flex, the deck beams twisted slightly. This torsion stressed the connections where beams met the hull frames. The wood responded with creaking that varied with the twist's direction and magnitude. The sound was often a deep groan, resonant and prolonged. The masts and their support structure added another layer. Masts were stepped. Their base rested in a socket that went through multiple decks down to the keelson. The mast had to move slightly as it flexed under wind pressure, but this movement had to be controlled. Mast partners, the heavy timbers surrounding the mast where it passed through each deck, constrained and strained this movement. As the mast worked, it rubbed against these partners. The sound depended on conditions. Light winds created subtle sounds. Heavy weather brought louder groaning, as the mast was pressed hard against its supports. The rigging transmitted sounds from above into the hull structure. Shrouds and steers, the standing rigging supporting the masts, were under constant tension. This tension pulled on the chain plates where the rigging attached to the hull. Every surge of wind or shift in load changed these forces and created sounds. Below deck, these rigging sounds came through as creaking at the chain plate attachment points. The sound had a different quality than hull flex, higher pitched and more immediate, directly reflecting conditions on deck above. The rudder and its steering mechanism created distinctive sounds. The rudder was massive, a large wooden blade that pivoted on hinges, called pintles and gudgeons. Steering the ship meant moving this heavy surface against water pressure. The rudder's movement stressed its mounts, the pintles worked in their gudgeons with every steering correction. In calm seas, this created occasional sounds. In rough weather, when the helmsman fought to keep course, the rudder mechanism was in constant motion and made continuous noise. The tiller or wheel mechanism transmitted forces from the rudder to the helmsman's station. This mechanical connection involved ropes, blocks, and linkages. All of these moved, stressed, and created their own sounds that carried through the ship's structure. Cargo also contributed to the soundscape. Properly secured cargo should remain still, but no securing was perfect. Barrels shifted slightly in their lashings, crates settled. These movements created thumps and scrapes that added to the overall sound. Loose cargo was dangerous and noisy. A barrel that broke free in heavy weather rolled with the ship's motion, crashing against whatever stopped it. The sound was alarming and demanded immediate attention. Loose cargo had to be secured before it caused damage or injury. The water itself created sounds through the hull. Beyond the external slapping and splashing, water worked against the hull's surface in ways that's transmitted as vibration and sound. Water pressure varied across the hull as the ship moved. These pressure changes stressed the planking and created subtle sounds. In very rough weather, the forces were extreme. Waves could strike the hull with enough force to cause a shudder felt throughout the ship. These impacts created sharp cracks followed by deep booming as the energy dissipated through the structure. Such sounds were jarring even to experienced sailors. The sound environment varied with location within the ship. Forward sections experienced sharper, more pronounced sounds as the bow slammed into waves. Midship sections had more resonant, sustained creaking from hull flex. Stern sections combined hull sounds with rudder mechanism noises. Vertical position also mattered. Higher decks experienced more wind-related sounds. Lower decks heard more water sounds through the hull. The gun deck, often at or near the waterline, occupied a middle ground with access to both sound sources. The ship's age affected its voice. New vessels with tight joints and fresh wood made different sounds than old ships. Aged timber became more brittle and created higher-pitched creaking. Worn joints moved more freely and made looser, rattling sounds. An experienced sailor could estimate a ship's condition partly by listening to its voice. Maintenance work changed the sounds temporarily. After recorking, the hull might be quieter as fresh oakum sealed seams more completely. After replacing worn rigging or tightening loose connections, particular sounds might diminish or disappear, but the sounds always returned. The sea was relentless in working on the structure. Tight joints worked loose, new caulking deteriorated. The ship's voice gradually grew louder and more complex with age and wear. The daily cycle affected sound levels. During the day, human activity created enough noise to partially mask the ship's natural sounds. Footsteps, voices, work sounds, and movement dominated the auditory environment. At night, human activity diminished. Men slept. Movement was minimal. In this relative quiet, the ship's own sounds became more prominent. The creaking, groaning, and other structural sounds that were background noise during the day moved to the foreground at night. For sailors trying to sleep, these sounds were inescapable. The hammock transmitted sounds through its attachment to the deck beams. The air carried sounds from all directions. The sleeper existed within a sphere of sound created by the ship's continuous dialogue with the sea. Adaptation was necessary and generally occurred. New sailors found the sounds disturbing initially. The creaking seemed ominous, suggesting imminent structural failure. The groaning sounded like distress. The overall noise level seemed incompatible with rest. But experienced sailors knew these sounds as normal. They understood that creaking meant the ship was flexing, not failing. Groaning was evidence of the structure working as designed. The sounds became reassuring rather than alarming. They confirmed the ship was functioning normally. Silence or unusual sounds were more concerning than the normal symphony. If the characteristic creaking stopped, it might mean the ship was not moving or that something had broken. New sounds suggested new problems, perhaps damage or a developing failure. The ship's voice thus served a monitoring function. Sailors subconsciously tracked the normal sound patterns. Deviations registered even during sleep. A sailor might wake to a sound that landsmen wouldn't even notice because it was different from the expected pattern. This sensitivity developed through long exposure. It was not taught formally, but learned through experience. The ear became trained to the ship's normal voice and alert to variations. This ability was part of a sailor's professional competence. The hull's symphony was the acoustic environment within which all other sounds occurred. It provided the baseline against which water sounds, pump sounds, and human sounds were heard. It was the wooden world's own voice, speaking constantly of its condition, its efforts, and its ongoing negotiation with the forces acting upon it. Understanding this symphony helps complete the picture of sleep at sea. Sailors did not rest in silence or even in simple noise. They rested within a complex, multi-layered soundscape where the ship itself was the primary voice, accompanied by water, wind, mechanical systems, and occasional human activity. This soundscape was not optional or avoidable. It was the acoustic reality of life aboard. Learning to sleep within it was as necessary as learning to sleep in the motion of the hammock or the cold of the lower decks. The sounds were part of the wooden world as fundamental as the timbers themselves, and sailors made their peace with them through acceptance and adaptation. Survival in the cold required specific materials. Among the fabrics available in the age of sail, wool stood alone as the essential material for maritime life. Understanding wool's properties and its use aboard ship reveals the foundation of thermal strategy. Wool comes from sheep. The fiber's structure is unique among natural textiles. Each wool fiber is covered in microscopic scales and has a crimped, wavy shape. These characteristics create air pockets when fibers are spun into yarn and woven into fabric. Air trapped between fibers provides insulation. Air itself is a poor conductor of heat. When still air is trapped in small pockets, it cannot circulate to carry heat away through convection. This trapped air creates a barrier that slows heat loss from the body. Wool's critical advantage was its behaviour when wet. Unlike plant fibres such as cotton or linen, wool retains much of its insulating capacity even after absorbing moisture. The reason lies in the fiber's internal structure. Wool fibers can absorb water vapour up to roughly 30% of their dry weight without feeling wet to the touch. This absorption happens inside the fibre itself, not just on the surface. The water is held in a way that does not collapse the air pockets between spheres. This meant that damp wool, and in the ship's humid environment, wool was always at least slightly damp, still provided insulation. A sailor wrapped in damp wool blankets retained far more body heat than he would wrapped in damp cotton or linen. The Navy understood this through experience rather than scientific analysis. Wool had been the material of choice for cold weather clothing for centuries. Naval suppliers specified wool for sailors' clothing because it worked, and because men survived winters at sea wearing it. The standard sailors' clothing included multiple wool items. Stockings were knitted from worsted wool, a tightly spun, durable yarn. These stockings extended to the knee, covering the lower leg completely. They provided the first layer of insulation for the legs. Breeches were made from heavier wool fabric. These garments extended from waist to just below the knee, where they overlapped with the stockings. The breeches were designed for durability and freedom of movement rather than warmth alone. But the wool fabric provided necessary insulation. Jackets formed the outer layer for the upper body. Naval jackets were relatively short, often ending at the hip. They were double-breasted, with overlapping front panels that could be fastened to provide extra protection against wind. The wool fabric was thick and tightly woven. Some jackets featured a split and overlap section at the back. This design allowed the garment to fit various body sizes more effectively, while also providing freedom of movement when climbing rigging or performing other physical tasks. Shirts worn under the jackets were typically linen rather than wool. Linen absorbed moisture from the body and dried relatively quickly, but in the ship's humid environment, even linen rarely dried completely. The wool outer layers had to provide insulation despite damp linen underneath. The colour of naval wool clothing was usually dark, grey was common. Brown or dark blue appeared on some vessels. These colours had practical advantages. They showed dirt less readily than light colours would, and that they were achieved with relatively stable, inexpensive dyes. The clothing was standardised through a system called slop clothing. The Navy contracted with suppliers who produced garments according to sealed patterns, official templates that specified dimensions and construction. This standardisation ensured consistent quality and sizing across the fleet. Sailors purchased these clothes from the ship's slop chest, a supply of standard garments carried aboard. The cost was deducted from their pay. This system ensured that men had access to appropriate clothing even when far from port. The fit of slop clothing was basic. Garments were made in limited sizes. The emphasis was on durability and function rather than tailored fit. Men often wore clothes that were slightly too large or too small, but that covered them adequately and provided the necessary wool insulation. Maintaining wool clothing was challenging. Washing required fresh water, which was rationed. Salt water could be used for washing, but it left salt residue in the fabric. This residue absorbed moisture from the air, keeping the garments damp. Most sailors wore the same clothes for extended periods without washing. Body oils, sweat and dirt accumulated. The wool became stiff and matted, but even in this degraded state it retained some insulating value. The deterioration of wool clothing was steady. Constant wear, exposure to salt air, and the ship's harsh environment broke down the fibres. Outer garments typically lasted 1 to 2 years before becoming too worn to provide adequate protection. This deterioration meant that older sailors, those nearing the end of long voyages, often had the least effective clothing. Their jackets were thinning, their stockings had holes, their breeches were patched and repatched, yet they had to make these worn garments work until they could be replaced. Bedding followed similar principles. The essential bedding items were also wool. The mattress filling was flock, processed wool fibres, often scraps and short fibres unsuitable for spinning into yarn. This flock was stuffed into a covering made from heavy fabric. The specifications for naval mattresses were precise. The Admiralty's instructions from around 1715 required at least 11 pounds of good, clean flock. This substantial weight created a dense, heavy mattress that provided crucial insulation. The mattress's primary function was not cushioning but thermal protection. In the hammock, the sleeper's weight compressed the mattress below. This compression could reduce insulation if the material was too soft. The dense flock resisted compression better than softer materials would. More critically, the mattress blocked cold air circulation beneath the suspended body. Without this barrier, convective heat loss from the underside would be severe. Cold air would flow freely beneath the hammock, constantly carrying away warmth. The mattress trapped still air in its fibres, preventing this circulation. The coverlet, the blanket that went over the sleeper, was equally important. Naval specifications required a weight of at least 6 pounds. This heavy wool blanket provided the upper layer of insulation. The coverlet's weight contributed to its effectiveness. Heavy fabric draped more completely around the body, reducing gaps where heat could escape. The weight also provided psychological comfort, the sensation of being held or protected that helps promote relaxation. The coverlet trapped the sleeper's body heat in the airspace between body and blanket. This warm air could not easily escape through the dense wool fabric. The result was a microclimate inside the bedding that was warmer than the surrounding air. Both mattress and coverlet absorbed moisture from the air and from the sleeper's body. They were never fully dry. But because they were wool, they continued to insulate even when damp. This was the difference between uncomfortable sleep and hypothermia. The bedding's condition deteriorated just as clothing did. The wool fibres broke down, the fabric wore thin in places, accumulated moisture and inadequate drying promoted gradual decay. Mould and mildew attacked the material when conditions allowed. Replacing bedding was difficult. The mattress and coverlet were substantial items that cost money. Sailors might keep bedding longer than was ideal simply because replacement was expensive or unavailable. Worn bedding provided less insulation but had to suffice. Pirates faced particular challenges with wool supplies. The Navy had established supply chains and regular provisioning. Pirates relied on what they could capture or purchase in the limited ports that tolerated them. Captured bedding and clothing might not fit properly, or might already be worn. Purchasing new wool items required money and access to suppliers. Many pirate crews likely made do with inadequate wool supplies, patching and reusing items until they literally fell apart. The quality of available wool varied. Better wool came from certain breeds of sheep raised in particular regions. English wool had a good reputation. Spanish merino wool was finer but less durable. The wool in naval slop clothing was chosen for durability and adequate warmth rather than softness or quality. Cheaper wool could be coarse and scratchy against the skin. But sailors were not choosing based on comfort. They were choosing based on survival. Scratchy wool that kept you alive was superior to soft linen that let you freeze. The weight of wool clothing and bedding was considerable. A fully dressed sailor in winter wear carried several pounds of fabric. The bedding added more pounds. This weight had to be moved around, worn during work, and managed daily. But the weight was necessary. Lighter fabrics did not provide adequate insulation. The physics of heat retention in damp, cold conditions required mass, enough material to trap sufficient air and resist moisture penetration. Wool provided this at the lowest weight practical for the needed insulation. The smell of wool permeated the lower decks. Wet wool has a distinctive odour, earthy and animal. Combined with the smell of unwashed bodies and the ship's other odours, the scent was strong. But like other smells, habituation occurred. The nose adapted and stopped registering what it could not escape. Wool's fire resistance was another advantage, though less critical than its insulating properties. Wool does not ignite easily. It smoulders rather than bursting into flame. This property made it safer than some alternatives in an environment where fire was the ultimate danger. The texture of aged wool changed. New wool was relatively soft and flexible. After months of use in the damp, salty environment, wool became stiffer. The fibres matted together. The fabric lost its initial texture and became more like felt. Dense, compact, less flexible, but still insulating. This matting actually increased wind resistance. The compressed fibres blocked air movement through the fabric more effectively. What seemed like deterioration in some ways improved performance in others. Understanding wool's properties and its use aboard ship reveals why thermal survival was possible. Without wool's unique ability to insulate when damp, sailors would not have survived winter nights in the unheated lower decks. The material's characteristics matched the environment's demands almost perfectly. Wool was not chosen because it was comfortable or pleasant. It was chosen because it worked. Because men wrapped in wool and sleeping under wool blankets maintained enough body heat to survive until morning. Because even damp, dirty, worn wool provided the insulation that meant the difference between life and death. The matter of wool was fundamental. It was the material foundation of the thermal strategy. Everything else, the hammock, the crowding, the routine, worked in concert with wool's properties to make survival possible. Without it, the other adaptations would not have been sufficient. The approach to sleeping in the cold was accumulation. Sailors added layer upon layer of clothing, creating a composite insulation system from multiple garments. Understanding this layering strategy reveals how they maximized the limited resources available. The practice of sleeping clothed was near universal aboard ship in winter. Unlike sleeping on land, where one might undress for bed, sailors typically remained in their daytime clothing when they climbed into their hammocks. This was not preference, but necessity. The reasons were practical. First, undressing meant removing the insulation that clothing provided. The brief period of undressing would expose the body to the full cold of the lower deck. The loss of body heat during this exposure would take time to recover. Second, clothing storage was limited. A sailor's personal possessions were minimal. Removing clothes meant finding somewhere to put them. In the crowded hammock space, there was little room for stowing garments. Keeping clothes on solved this problem. Third, rapid response to emergencies required readiness. Naval life involved watches, periods of duty that came at all hours. A man sleeping during his off-watch period might be called to duty with little warning. Being already dressed meant he could respond immediately. The layering began with the innermost garment, the linen shirt. This sat directly against the skin. Linen absorbed perspiration and body moisture. This kept the outer wool layers drier, though in practice moisture eventually penetrated all layers. Over the shirt came additional layers depending on available clothing. A sailor with multiple shirts might wear 2 or even 3. Each additional layer trapped more air and provided more insulation. The layers worked together, creating multiple barriers to heat loss. The wool stockings covered the legs from foot to knee. These were often the only covering for the lower legs, as breeches ended at the knee. Keeping the stockings on during sleep maintained warmth in the extremities. The feet were particularly vulnerable to cold. Circulation to the extremities can be reduced when the body tries to preserve core temperature. Cold feet were both uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. Frostbite could occur in extreme conditions. Some sailors wore multiple pairs of stockings. 2 pairs created additional insulation and also protected against the wear that single stockings would suffer. The outer pair bore most of the friction and degradation, preserving the inner pair longer. Breeches stayed on during sleep. These covered the thighs and provided necessary insulation for the lower body. The overlap between breeches and stockings created a double layer at the knee, preventing gaps where cold could penetrate. The jacket remained the outer layer for the torso. This garment was the primary wind barrier and outer insulation. Its double-breasted design meant the front was effectively double-layered when fastened. Sailors typically kept jackets on while sleeping, fully fastened to prevent the panels from falling open. Some sailors had waistcoats, intermediate garments worn between shirt and jacket. These added another insulating layer. The waistcoat was usually wool and fit more closely than the jacket, creating an additional air-trapping layer. Headwear varied. Some men wore wool caps to bed. The head is a significant source of heat loss. Blood vessels near the scalp can radiate substantial heat. Covering the head retained this warmth. A wool cap pulled down over the ears provided protection for these exposed vulnerable areas. Other sailors used fabric wrapped around the head and neck. A cloth or scarf could protect the ears, neck, and part of the face from cold air. This improvised insulation used whatever materials were available. The hands presented challenges. Working on a ship required bare hands for many tasks. Rope work was nearly impossible with covered hands. But at night, protecting the hands from cold was important. Some sailors tucked their hands inside their clothing, under armpits or against the torso while sleeping. This position kept the hands warm using body heat. Others might have mittens or worn gloves if available, though these were not standard issue. The layering strategy extended to the bedding. The sailor entered his hammock wearing all these clothes. He then lay on the mattress, itself 11 pounds of wool insulation, and pulled the coverlet over himself. The coverlet could be arranged to provide maximum coverage. Drawing it up over the shoulders and tucking it around the body created a seal that trapped warm air. Some sailors pulled the coverlet over their heads, leaving only a small opening for breathing. This complete enclosure created a microenvironment inside the bedding. The sailor's body heat warmed the air in this small space. The multiple layers of fabric, clothing and bedding prevented this warmth from escaping rapidly. The enclosed space also became humid from breathing and perspiration. This humidity was problematic in some ways. It contributed to dampness in the fabric, but it also reduced evaporative heat loss from the skin and respiratory tract. The hammock's shape aided the layering strategy. The canvas curved around the body, bringing the coverlet into close contact. There were fewer air gaps than there would be in a flatbed where blankets might tent up, allowing cold air to circulate underneath. Additional items could be incorporated if available. Some sailors had extra clothing that could be used as supplementary blankets. A second jacket, if owned, might be laid over the body for extra insulation. Spare stockings could be worn on the hands as improvised mittens. The accumulation of layers had limits. Too many layers could restrict movement and blood circulation. Clothing that was too tight compressed the insulating airspaces, reducing effectiveness. There was a balance between adding layers and maintaining function. The weight of multiple layers and heavy bedding was substantial. A fully layered sailor under his 6-pound coverlet and lying on his 11-pound mattress was carrying significant mass. This weight pressed down, creating a sensation of being held or weighted that some found comforting. The psychological aspect of layering should not be overlooked. The act of adding layers, of deliberately wrapping oneself against the cold, provided a sense of agency. It was something the sailor could do to improve his situation, even marginally. This contrasted with the many aspects of shipboard life over which sailors had no control. They could not change the weather, could not heat the lower deck, could not stop the dampness, but they could put on another layer, could arrange their bedding more carefully, could take these small actions toward their own survival. The morning reversal of this process was part of the daily routine. Upon waking, sailors emerged from their layered cocoons. They might remove outer jackets to allow freedom of movement during work, but the underlying layers often remained. Some adjustment happened, but complete undressing was rare. This meant that clothing was worn continuously for days or weeks. The same stockings stayed on. The same shirt remained against the skin. The accumulation of wear and body oils was significant, but washing required resources that were not readily available. The layering strategy was more sophisticated on naval vessels with better supply chains. Officers and men on well-provisioned ships had access to more clothing items. They could rotate items, wear fresher garments, and maintain better hygiene. Pirates and sailors on poorly supplied vessels had fewer options. They worked with whatever clothes they had wearing them until they literally fell apart. The layering strategy remained the same in principle, but the quality and quantity of layers varied significantly. The effectiveness of layering also depended on the condition of the clothing. New, intact wool provided better insulation than worn, thinning fabric. Holes and tears created gaps where heat escaped. Patches helped, but could not fully restore the garment's insulating capacity. Repairs were constant. Sailors mended their clothes regularly, using needle and thread to close holes and reinforce weak areas. This work happened during off-watch time. Men sat in groups, working on their garments, extending the life of clothing that had to last. The accumulation of damp in the layers was gradual but persistent. The innermost linen absorbed moisture first. This moisture slowly migrated outward through the wool layers. The outermost layer eventually became noticeably damp to the touch. Drying opportunities were limited and weather-dependent. On calm, sunny days, items might be hung in the rigging to air. The sun and wind would remove some moisture, but complete drying was rare. Items brought back below deck quickly reabsorbed moisture from the humid atmosphere. The layering strategy thus operated in a state of perpetual dampness. The goal was not to stay dry, that was impossible, but to retain warmth despite being damp. Wool's properties made this possible. The layers worked even when saturated, though less effectively than when dry. Understanding the layering strategy reveals the detailed, practical nature of thermal survival. It was not a single solution, but an accumulation of small measures. Each layer added slightly more insulation. Each careful arrangement of fabric reduced heat loss marginally. The sum of these small improvements made survival possible. The sailor, wrapped in multiple layers of damp wool, lying on his flock mattress under his heavy coverlet, was employing a sophisticated thermal strategy developed through generations of maritime experience. It was not comfortable, it was not pleasant, but it worked well enough to allow sleep and therefore survival through the long, cold nights of winter at sea. The bedding's physical mass was as important as its material. The specific weights mandated by naval regulations reflected practical experience with heat retention. Understanding why these weights mattered reveals another dimension of the thermal strategy. The mattress specification required at least 11 pounds of wool flock. This was not an arbitrary number. It represented the minimum mass needed to provide adequate insulation in the hammock's unique geometry. The flock itself was composed of short wool fibres. These were remnants from processing longer fibres for spinning, the bits and pieces that could not be made into yarn. Flock was therefore relatively inexpensive compared to woven fabric, making it suitable for filling. The fibre structure created countless small air pockets when compressed. As the sailor's weight pressed down on the mattress, the flock compressed but did not completely collapse. Some air remained trapped between fibres. This air provided the actual insulation. 11 pounds of flock, when distributed across the mattress's area, created a layer several inches thick. This thickness was critical. Too thin, and the cold air circulating beneath the hammock would conduct heat away through the material. Too thick would be excessive, adding weight without proportional benefit. The mattress had to balance competing demands. It needed enough thickness to insulate effectively. but it also had to remain manageable for the sailors to roll up each morning and stow. Excessive bulk made handling difficult and took up too much storage space. The compression resistance of the flock affected insulation performance. When a body pressed down, the flock compressed more directly beneath pressure points. Hips, shoulders, head. These compressed areas had less trapped air and therefore less insulating value. This compression was why the mattress needed to be dense enough to resist excessive flattening. Softer filling would compress too much under body weight, reducing insulation precisely where it was most needed. The 11-pound specification created a mattress that compressed somewhat, but maintained critical thickness. The mattress's position in the hammock affected its function. The canvas hammock curved around and partially up the sides of the mattress. This created edges where the mattress met the hammock fabric. These edges were potential thermal weak points, areas where insulation was thinner. A well-filled mattress reached the edges of the hammock, providing consistent insulation across its area. Undersized or inadequately filled mattresses left gaps. Cold air could reach the sleeper's body through these gaps, creating cold spots that disrupted sleep. The coverlet's specified weight, at least 6 pounds, served different purposes than the mattress. Where the mattress blocked heat loss downward, the coverlet prevented heat loss upward and outward from the body's top surface and sides. 6 pounds of wool fabric meant a blanket that was dense and thick. When draped over the body, this heavy fabric trapped warm air between itself and the sleeper. The weight helped the blanket conform to the body's shape, reducing air gaps. The psychological effect of the coverlet's weight was significant. Modern research confirms what sailors experienced. Weighted blankets promote relaxation and deeper sleep. The sensation of pressure triggers physiological responses that reduce stress and anxiety. In the ship's stressful, uncomfortable environment, this calming effect was valuable. The heavy coverlet provided physical comfort beyond its thermal function. Its weight was reassuring, creating a sense of protection or security. The coverlet's draping behavior depended on its weight and flexibility. Heavy wool fabric draped more smoothly than lighter materials. It fell into curves rather than creating tent-like spaces. This draping brought the fabric into contact with the body across more surface area. This contact was thermally efficient. Air gaps between body and blanket reduce insulation by allowing convection. Warm air rises and escapes from openings. The coverlet's weight eliminated many of these gaps by pressing the fabric against the body. The coverlet could be arranged to maximize coverage. Pulling it up to the chin covered the torso completely. Tucking edges under the body or around the sides created a seal. Some sailors pulled the coverlet over their heads, creating a fabric envelope that covered everything except the face. This complete wrapping trapped the most heat but could feel confining. It also became more humid inside as exhaled breath accumulated in the enclosed space. Some men tolerated this better than others. Personal preference balanced thermal efficiency against comfort and breathing ease. Both mattress and coverlet absorbed moisture over time. The humid ship atmosphere, perspiration from the body, and occasional contact with wet surfaces all contributed. The bedding's mass meant it could absorb substantial water without becoming saturated. This absorption had mixed effects. Wet bedding was heavier than dry bedding. Water adds significant weight. The 11-pound mattress might weigh 13 or 14 pounds when damp. The 6-pound coverlet might reach 7 or 8 pounds wet. This additional weight made the bedding harder to handle during daily stowing. Wet fabric was also stiffer and less pleasant to handle. But the absorption also meant the bedding acted as a buffer, absorbing moisture that would otherwise accumulate directly against the skin. The wool's ability to insulate while damp meant the weight gain from moisture did not proportionally reduce thermal performance. A 13-pound damp mattress insulated nearly as well as an 11-pound dry one. This resilience was essential in the perpetually humid environment. Drying the bedding required specific conditions. The mattress and coverlet needed sun, wind, and time. Favourable weather allowed these items to be brought on deck and spread in the rigging. Hours of exposure would remove some moisture, though complete drying was unlikely. Naval regulations sometimes specified airing bedding periodically, but weather and operational demands did not always permit this. Men often went weeks without the opportunity to properly air their bedding. The gradual accumulation of dampness continued unchecked. The distribution of bedding among the crew was not equal. New recruits or men of lower status might receive minimal bedding or bedding in poor condition. More established sailors or those with resources might have better quality items. Officers, of course, had superior bedding. Their mattresses might be thicker, filled with better quality materials. Their coverlets might be finer, wool, or even include additional blankets. The thermal hierarchy extended to bedding as it did to sleeping location. Pirates operated with whatever bedding they could acquire. Captured bedding might be distributed among the crew, with preference given to senior or favoured members. Some pirates slept with minimal bedding, perhaps only the hammock canvas and whatever clothes they wore. The difference between adequate and inadequate bedding was measurable in comfort but critical for health. A sailor with proper 11-pound mattress and 6-pound coverlet could sleep in conditions that would cause hypothermia in a man with less insulation. The bedding's maintenance was the sailor's responsibility. Repairs to torn fabric, redistribution of flock that had shifted or clumped, and general care extended the bedding's useful life. Neglected bedding deteriorated faster and provided less protection. The mattress's flock could migrate within its casing. Over time and use, the filling shifted toward the edges or ends, leaving the centre thinner. Periodic redistribution, working the flock back into even distribution, maintained consistent insulation. The coverlet developed worn spots where friction was greatest, usually along the edges and in areas that rubbed against rough surfaces. These thin areas provided less insulation. Patches could reinforce them, but the overall degradation was progressive. Replacement of bedding was expensive relative to a sailor's pay. These items represented a significant investment. Men used their bedding until it was genuinely beyond further use, then faced the difficult choice of purchasing replacement items or making do with inadequate insulation. The Navy's specification of minimum weight suggests that lighter bedding had been tried and found insufficient. The 11-pound mattress and 6-pound coverlet represented hard-won knowledge about minimum adequate insulation for survival. These weights were not excessive for the conditions. In fact, men with access to additional blankets often used them. More insulation provided more warmth, up to the practical limit of what could be managed and stowed. The physical sensation of the bedding defined the sleep experience. The slight give of the flock mattress beneath the body, the substantial weight of the coverlet pressing down, the all-encompassing fabric surrounding the sleeper. These sensations were the immediate tactile reality of attempting rest. The bedding worked in concert with the other elements, the hammock's suspension, the wool clothing's layers, the surrounding body's heat. Remove any element and the system's effectiveness declined. The weights specified for mattress and coverlet were calibrated to work within this larger system. Understanding the weight of insulation reveals the precision behind what might seem like simple bedding. The specific masses were functional requirements, not arbitrary standards. They reflected generations of experience with what worked and what did not in the unique environment of the ship. The weight was a burden during the day, additional mass to handle and stow. But at night, that same weight became comfort and protection. The heavy fabric and dense filling were the sailor's defense against the cold, the physical embodiment of the barrier between survival and suffering through the long winter night. The ship's interior was not uniformly cold. Temperature varied by location, creating a thermal geography that determined where different ranks slept. Understanding this distribution reveals both the physics of cold and the social structure of the vessel. The coldest areas were those in direct contact with the ocean. Hull planks below the waterline were continuously chilled by the surrounding seawater. In winter, this water could be barely above freezing. The thick oak timbers conducted this cold inward. The areas immediately adjacent to these cold planks were therefore the coldest spaces aboard. Hammocks hung near the hull experienced this cold directly. The sleeper's side nearest the hull lost heat to the cold wood through radiation. The air between body and hull was chilled by contact with the timbers. The gun deck's position relative to the waterline determined its baseline temperature. On many vessels, the gun deck was at or slightly above the waterline. Half the surrounding hull was in contact with water, half with air. Both were cold in winter, but the submerged portion was consistently colder. The vertical temperature gradient created stratification. Warmer air rose toward the deck above. Colder air settled toward the bilge below. The gun deck occupied a middle zone where temperatures were moderate relative to the extremes above and below, but moderate was still cold. The difference between the coldest area near the bilge and the slightly warmer air at the gun deck's upper levels might be only a few degrees. This small difference mattered to thermal comfort, but did not transform the experience from cold to warm. Distance from the hull affected temperature. Hammocks hung in the centre of the gun deck away from the hull planks experienced slightly warmer conditions. The sleeper was further from the cold surfaces and surrounded by more air that could be warmed by other bodies. The cannons themselves were metal heat sinks. Iron has high thermal mass. It absorbs and releases heat readily. The cannons quickly reached the same temperature as the surrounding air. In cold weather they became extremely cold. Hammocks hung near the cannons experienced additional radiant heat loss. The sleeper's body radiated heat toward the cold metal. The guns absorbed this heat, remaining cold and continuously drawing warmth from anyone nearby. The spaces between guns were where hammocks had to hang. These locations were necessary to leave room for gun operation during battle. But they placed sleepers in close proximity to these cold metal masses. There was no avoiding this exposure. Hatches and companionways created drafts. Even when closed, these openings were not perfectly sealed. Cold air could seep through gaps. The areas near hatches experienced more air movement, and therefore more convective heat loss. Sleepers unfortunate enough to have hammock positions near hatches dealt with these drafts throughout the night. The moving air prevented the formation of a warm microenvironment around their bodies. Heat was continuously carried away by the air currents. The forward sections of the ship experienced different motion than midship or stern sections. The bow rose and fell more dramatically with wave action. This motion affected comfort, but also influenced temperature distribution through its effect on air circulation. The stern, where officers' cabins were located, had several advantages. The structure was more enclosed, with more internal partitions. These created smaller air volumes that retained heat better than the open gun deck. The captain's cabin and officers' quarters also benefited from being above the gun deck, in the slightly warmer air of the upper temperature gradient. Additionally, these spaces were further from the bilge and its cold, damp influence. Fixed bunks, available to officers, provided better insulation than hammocks in some respects. A bunk with 3 sides against walls or partitions was protected from air movement on those sides. Only the open front exposed the sleeper to the room's air. However, bunks also meant sleeping on a surface in continuous contact with the ship's structure. This contact provided a path for heat conduction directly into the cold wood. The thermal advantages were mixed, though overall, officers' sleeping conditions were superior to those of common sailors. The concept of the thermal hierarchy reflected the ship's social structure. Rank determined sleeping location, and sleeping location determined exposure to cold. This was not deliberately punitive. It was the natural result of assigning the more enclosed, protected spaces to officers. Common sailors accepted this hierarchy as normal. The ship's organisation placed officers in positions of privilege across all aspects of life. Better sleeping quarters were consistent with better food, better clothing allowances, and better working conditions. For pirates, the hierarchy was less rigid but still present. Captains and senior crew members claimed the better sleeping locations. Newer or lower status crew members took what was left. The basic pattern of thermal geography remained even when formal rank structure was looser. The areas near the galley, when the stove was allowed to operate, were warmer. The stove radiated heat that spread to adjacent spaces. Hammocks positioned near the galley benefited from this proximity, but the galley was off limits during foul weather, precisely when extra warmth was most needed. Some areas of the ship were uninhabitable for sleeping due to extreme conditions. The spaces near the bow where wave impacts were strongest were too violent. The areas near the bilge were too damp and foul. These spaces were avoided, concentrating sleepers in the marginal but tolerable zones. The density of hammocks affected local temperature. Areas where hammocks were hung closely together created pockets of relatively warmer air. The collective body heat of many sleepers in proximity raised the temperature of that microzone. Conversely, isolated hammocks, those positioned away from the main concentration due to structural necessity, were colder. The sleeper lacked the benefit of nearby bodies' heat and had to rely entirely on his own heat production and his bedding's insulation. The cold penetrated from multiple directions simultaneously, from below, through the deck and from the bilge's cold air, from the sides through the hull planks, from above, through the deck beams chilled by the deck above. The sleeper existed in 3-dimensional cold. This omnidirectional cold made effective insulation challenging. There was no warm side to orient toward. All directions offered only variants of cold. The insulation had to work equally well in all orientations. The geographic reality of cold meant that sailors could not escape it by moving. There was no warm corner to retreat to. The entire available space was cold. Choice of location affected the degree of cold but could not eliminate it. This geographic determinism shaped the collective experience. Everyone was cold. Some were colder than others based on position, but no one was comfortable. The shared hardship created a common experience that cut across individual differences. Understanding the geography of cold reveals why the thermal strategies had to be comprehensive. Sailors could not rely on finding favourable microclimates. They had to carry their insulation with them, create their warmth through layers and bedding, and accept that the environment itself offered no refuge. The ship's internal temperature map was written in wood and metal, in proximity to water and air, in the physics of heat conduction and radiation. This map was invisible but deeply felt. It determined who suffered more and who suffered slightly less, but it ensured that everyone, from captain to newest recruit, understood that winter at sea meant cold. In the absence of fire, the sailors themselves became the heat source. Packed together in the crowded gun deck, their combined body heat created the only warmth available. Understanding this biological heating system reveals the final critical element of thermal survival. Each human body generates heat through metabolic processes. The chemical reactions that sustain life produce thermal energy as a byproduct. At rest, an average adult male produces roughly 100 watts of heat, similar to a standard incandescent light bulb. This heat production is continuous. As long as the body is alive and functioning, it generates warmth. The challenge is not producing heat, but retaining it in a cold environment. Without effective insulation and favourable conditions, this heat dissipates as quickly as it is produced. A single sailor in an isolated hammock had only his own heat production to rely on. His body warmed the air immediately surrounding him. His bedding trapped some of this warmth. But the cold deck, hull, and surrounding air constantly drew heat away. The balance between heat production and heat loss determined whether the sailor could maintain adequate body temperature. In extreme cold with inadequate insulation, heat loss could exceed production. Core temperature would gradually drop, leading eventually to hypothermia. But sailors were not isolated. The gun deck held dozens of men sleeping in close proximity. Their hammocks hung as close together as the ship's structure and operational requirements allowed. This crowding, though uncomfortable in other ways, was thermally beneficial. When hammocks were hung close enough that the sleepers were within a few feet of each other, their individual heat spheres overlapped. Each man's body heat contributed to warming the shared airspace. The collective thermal output was substantial. 50 men on a gun deck, each producing 100 watts, generated 5,000 watts of heat, equivalent to several space heaters running continuously. This heat accumulated in the enclosed space, raising the local temperature above what the cold hull alone would create. The effect was most pronounced when hatches were closed. Without ventilation, the warm air could not escape. It accumulated in the gun deck, gradually warming the entire volume. The temperature might rise only a few degrees, but this increase was significant relative to the baseline cold. The density of human packing was therefore not just a space-saving measure, but a thermal strategy. The crowding that made sleeping uncomfortable and contributed to disease transmission also created survivable temperature conditions. The hammock's height distribution affected heat circulation. In areas where hammocks could be hung at multiple levels, the upper hammocks benefited from rising warm air. The lower hammocks were in cooler air that had settled downward. This stratification was subtle but real. Men in lower hammocks might notice their sleeping space was slightly colder. Those in upper positions experienced marginally warmer conditions. The differences were small, perhaps a degree or two, but perceptible over a long night. The collective heat generation also created humidity. Each man's breathing added water vapour to the air. Perspiration, even minimal amounts, evaporated and increased atmospheric moisture. This humidity had mixed effects. High humidity reduced evaporative heat loss from the skin and respiratory tract. Dry air would wick moisture away more quickly, carrying heat with it. The humid atmosphere limited this evaporative cooling, helping sleepers retain warmth. However, the humidity also contributed to condensation problems. Warm, moist air rising from the sleepers contacted the cold hull timbers and deck beams above. Water condensed on these cold surfaces, gradually dripping back down onto the hammocks and sleepers below. The balance between warmth generation and moisture accumulation had to be managed. Too little crowding meant insufficient heat. Too much crowding increased humidity to levels that made everything dripping wet. The typical density represented an empirical balance. Movement disrupted the thermal equilibrium. When a man left his hammock during the night, to relieve himself, to respond to a call for duty, or for any other reason, he created an opening in the collective heat sphere. Cold air rushed in to fill the gap. The surrounding sleepers experienced this as a brief cold draft. The disruption was temporary, as body heat rewarmed the displaced air, but it was noticeable. Minimizing movement through the night was therefore beneficial not just for individual rest, but for collective thermal maintenance. The collective furnace operated most efficiently when everyone remained still and in place. The ideal scenario was all hammocks occupied, all sleepers wrapped in their bedding, all bodies generating heat that accumulated in the shared space. This ideal was rarely achieved. Watch rotations meant men coming and going throughout the night. Illness or personal needs required movement. The collective heat source fluctuated with these disruptions but maintained a baseline warmth that made survival possible. The psychological dimension of collective warmth was significant. Knowing that others were nearby sharing the same conditions provided comfort beyond the physical warmth. The presence of other bodies was reassuring in the dark, cold environment. The sounds of other sleepers, breathing, occasional movement, the creaking of neighbouring hammocks confirmed this presence. A man was not alone in his cold, damp hammock. He was part of a collective enduring the same conditions together. This collective experience also created social pressure to remain in the hammock. Getting up unnecessarily disturbed neighbours. The social expectation was to stay put unless absolutely required to move. This pressure reinforced the thermal strategy by minimising heat loss from movement. The heat generation varied among individuals. Larger men with more body mass generated more heat. Younger men with higher metabolic rates produced more warmth than older men. Those who had eaten well generated more heat than those on reduced rations. But these variations averaged out across the group. The collective heat depended on the total number of bodies, not on any individual's exceptional heat production. The system was robust because it relied on cumulative output rather than any single critical source. The loss of men from the gun deck, whether from death, illness requiring isolation, or reassignment to other duties, reduced the collective heat source. Fewer bodies meant less total heat generation. The remaining men had to compensate by relying more on their individual insulation. This created a feedback effect. As conditions became harder, more men might become ill. Fewer healthy men meant less collective heat. This made conditions harder still. The collective furnace operated most effectively when all positions were filled with healthy, heat-generating bodies. Pirates on smaller vessels experienced this effect more acutely. A small crew meant fewer bodies generating heat. The loss of even one or two men significantly reduced the collective warmth. Larger naval vessels with bigger crews had more thermal mass and resilience. The collective heat strategy was passive. It required no special equipment or fuel. Men simply had to be present and alive. Their bodies provided the heat automatically. This made it reliable and sustainable for long voyages, but it also meant the strategy could not be improved beyond maximizing the number of warm bodies in the space. There was no way to make each body generate more heat without increasing food consumption, which was limited. The system operated near its natural maximum. The strategy's elegance was its simplicity. No technology was needed. No special knowledge was required. Men had simply to sleep close together, and their bodies would collectively create warmth. Evolution had equipped them with the heat source. Naval organization provided the crowding that made it effective. Understanding the collective furnace reveals the final piece of the thermal survival puzzle. The hammock provided stability and elevation. Wool provided insulation. Layering maximized that insulation. And the density of bodies provided the actual heat source that made the other elements effective. Remove any piece, and the system failed. Without the collective heat, even the best insulation could not prevent hypothermia. Without the insulation, the collective heat would dissipate too quickly to raise temperatures. The elements worked together, creating a survival system from the limited resources available aboard a wooden ship in winter. The sailors slept in a furnace of their own making, fueled by their own metabolic fires, sharing warmth in the only way possible when external heat was forbidden. Their proximity was necessity. their collective body heat the difference between surviving the night and succumbing to the cold. Movement meant heat loss. This simple principle governed behaviour during the coldest nights. Understanding why stillness was essential reveals another dimension of survival strategy aboard winter ships. The human body maintains a microclimate around itself. In the space between skin and clothing, or between body and bedding, air is warmed by body heat. This warm air creates an insulating layer that reduces heat loss. The layer is fragile and easily disrupted. Any movement disturbs this warm air layer. When a sailor shifted position in his hammock, the motion pumped warm air out from inside his bedding. Cold air rushed in to replace it. The body then had to expend energy reheating this fresh cold air. The energy cost of reheating was significant. In an environment where the body was already working to maintain core temperature, this additional demand could be costly. Frequent movement meant continuous heat loss and continuous reheating, draining the body's thermal reserves. The hammock itself encouraged stillness through its design. The suspended canvas created an unstable platform. Movement required careful adjustment to avoid setting the hammock swinging excessively or rotating. This natural constraint reduced unnecessary motion. The cocoon effect of the canvas wrapping around the body also limited movement options. There was less freedom to roll or shift than in a flat bed. The sleeper found a position and tended to remain in it because changing position required more effort. The tightness of hammock spacing reinforced stillness. With neighbouring hammocks close enough to touch, large movements risked disturbing adjacent sleepers. The social constraint of not disrupting others' rest encouraged remaining motionless. The cold itself motivated stillness. Once a sailor had achieved some degree of warmth inside his bedding, he was reluctant to disturb it. The momentary comfort of shifting position was not worth the subsequent period of cold as the disturbed air layers stabilised again. This created a pattern where men found a tolerable position and maintained it for extended periods. They might remain nearly motionless for hours, enduring minor discomforts rather than moving and triggering heat loss. The physiological state of sleep also promoted stillness. During deep sleep, the body naturally reduces movement. Muscle activity decreases. The sleeper enters periods of profound stillness punctuated by occasional position changes. In the cold environment, even these natural position changes carried costs. The body's unconscious system seemed to recognise this. Sailors often reported sleeping more still at sea than on land, as if the body adapted by minimising motion. The breathing pattern affected heat retention. Slow, steady breathing minimised air exchange. Rapid breathing increased the rate at which warm air was exhaled and cold air inhaled. This represented a heat loss pathway through the respiratory system. Deep sleep naturally slowed breathing. The respiratory rate decreased, and each breath became deeper and more efficient. This physiological change reduced heat loss through breathing, while maintaining adequate oxygen supply. The strategy of stillness began before sleep. As sailors settled into their hammocks for the night, they arranged themselves deliberately. They positioned their bodies to minimize pressure points that might require later adjustment. They arranged their bedding to provide maximum coverage. This preparation was methodical. The coverlet was pulled up and tucked carefully. Clothing was adjusted to eliminate bunched fabric that might cause discomfort. The goal was to create conditions that would allow extended stillness without the need for readjustment. The diagonal position across the hammock was part of this strategy. Lying diagonally provided better stability than lying lengthwise. It also distributed body weight more evenly, reducing pressure on specific points. This position could be maintained longer without requiring movement for comfort. The hands position was carefully chosen. Tucking them inside clothing or under the coverlet protected them from cold. But the position also had to be sustainable. Hands placed in positions that would become uncomfortable required eventual movement. Finding the right position meant stillness was maintainable. The head's position mattered similarly. Some sailors found that wrapping fabric around the head and neck, then maintaining a specific position, provided warmth and comfort that could last through the night. Others used rolled clothing as pillows to support the head in a sustainable position. The accumulation of small adjustments, clothing arrangement, bedding position, body orientation, created an optimized state for stillness. Once achieved, this state was preserved through conscious effort to avoid disrupting it. The cold provided immediate feedback about movement. Any shift that exposed skin or disturbed bedding was instantly felt as a rush of cold air. This negative reinforcement trained sailors to minimize motion. New sailors learned this through experience. Their first winter nights involved excessive movement as they sought comfort. Each movement brought cold. Gradually they learned that stillness, even in a less than ideal position, was warmer than continuous adjustment. The watch system influenced stillness strategy. Sailors not on watch could sleep for extended periods. Knowing they had hours before being called encouraged deeper relaxation and longer stillness. Those expecting a call remained more alert and might move more, though this was counterproductive for warmth. The depth of exhaustion affected stillness. Profoundly exhausted men entered deep sleep quickly and moved little. Their bodies prioritized rest over comfort, accepting minor discomforts without response. This exhaustion-induced stillness was perhaps the most effective, though it came at the cost of severe fatigue. The morning transition from sleep to waking involved a deliberate sequence. Sailors did not leap from their hammocks. They emerged gradually, allowing their bodies to adjust. The initial movements were minimal, preserving warmth as long as possible before the inevitable exposure to the gun deck's cold air. This gradual emergence was both practical and necessary. Sudden movement from deep sleep could trigger dizziness, especially after hours of stillness in the hammock's suspended position. The body needed time to readjust to active movement and vertical orientation. The collective stillness of the gun deck created a particular atmosphere. In the deep night hours when most men slept, movement was minimal. The hammocks swayed gently with the ship's motion, but the bodies within them remained largely still. The space took on a quality of suspended animation. This collective stillness reinforced individual stillness. The absence of movement around you encouraged remaining motionless yourself. The quiet, dark space with its forest of gently swaying hammocks created an environment conducive to rest through immobility. Breaking this stillness carried social weight. A man thrashing about in his hammock or repeatedly getting up drew attention. It disturbed the collective rest. Social pressure encouraged finding stillness and maintaining it, both for personal warmth and for the group's peace. The strategy of stillness extended to the bladder. Drinking less before sleep reduced the need to urinate during the night. Getting up to relieve oneself meant leaving the warm hammock, exposing oneself to the full cold of the deck, and disturbing the carefully established thermal equilibrium. Many sailors simply held their bladders through the night rather than face this disruption. This was uncomfortable but preferable to the cold and the difficulty of re-establishing warmth after returning to the hammock. The physical position for sleeping in extreme cold was often described as tucked or curled. Drawing the knees toward the chest reduced the body's exposed surface area. This fetal position minimized heat loss while fitting well within the hammock's curved shape. This position could be maintained for extended periods once established. The body's flexibility allowed the curled posture without strain. The hammock's canvas supported the curved shape. Once settled, a sailor might remain in this position for hours. The strategy worked because it addressed heat loss from all pathways simultaneously. Stillness reduced convective loss by preserving the warm air layer. The curled position reduced radiative loss by minimizing surface area. The maintained bedding arrangement reduced conductive loss by keeping insulation in place. Pirates and naval sailors alike employed this strategy. It required no equipment or special knowledge. It was an observable principle. Movement meant cold, stillness preserved warmth. Once learned, it became automatic. The nights when stillness was most critical were those when cold was most severe. During the worst weather, when temperatures dropped and dampness was highest, the strategy of stillness became essential for survival. Movement could mean the difference between maintaining adequate body temperature and sliding toward hypothermia. The morning evidence of successful stillness was visible. Men emerged from their hammocks in the positions they had maintained through the night. Their bodies had adapted to the constraints, finding rest within imposed immobility. Understanding the strategy of stillness reveals how sailors actively managed their thermal state. They were not passive victims of cold, but active participants in their survival. Through conscious limitation of movement, they conserved the heat their bodies produced and their insulation captured. The strategy was simple but required discipline. The urge to shift position, to scratch an itch, to adjust uncomfortable clothing was constant. Resisting these urges meant accepting minor discomforts to preserve the greater comfort of retained warmth. This discipline was learned through necessity. The cold was an effective teacher. Those who moved frequently suffered more. Those who mastered stillness slept better and woke warmer. Over time, stillness became ingrained, a habit developed through winter after winter at sea. The strategy of stillness was the final behavioural adaptation. Combined with the physical adaptations of hammock, wool, layering and collective heat, it completed the survival system. Sailors who understood and practiced stillness added a crucial element to their defence against the winter night's cold. The lower decks had a distinctive smell that defined the sensory environment as completely as cold or sound. Understanding these odours reveals another dimension of the space where sailors sought rest. The bilge provided the dominant odour. The stagnant water at the ship's bottom contained accumulated waste, organic matter, and the residue of years of seepage. This mixture produced a smell that historical accounts describe as overwhelming to anyone encountering it fresh. The odour was complex. It combined the smell of decay, the sharp tang of waste, and the musty scent of long-standing water. In warm weather, bacterial action intensified the smell. In cold weather, it was somewhat reduced but never absent. The bilge smell permeated upward through the deck gratings and planking. It saturated the air of the lower decks. Everything absorbed this odour: wood, fabric, rope, and eventually the sailors themselves. The smell became embedded in the ship's structure. Tar and pitch contributed their own sharp medicinal scent. These substances were used extensively in ship construction and maintenance. They sealed seams, preserved wood, and protected rope. Their smell was persistent and penetrating. Fresh tar and pitch had stronger odours than aged applications. After tarring work, the smell would be intense for days, but even old weathered pitch maintained a noticeable scent. The combination of fresh and aged applications created layers of smell. The odour of tar was not universally unpleasant. Some sailors found it almost comforting in its familiarity. It smelled of the ship, of maintenance work, of the maritime world. But for those unused to it, the sharpness could be overwhelming, especially in enclosed spaces. Damp wool created its own characteristic smell. Wet wool has an animal odour, earthy and organic. It comes from lanolin and other compounds in the fibre. In the humid atmosphere of the lower decks, wool was always at least slightly damp and therefore always producing this smell. The collective smell of many sailors wearing damp wool was substantial. Multiply the individual odour by dozens of men in close quarters, and the intensity increases significantly. This wool smell mixed with the other odours to create a distinctive maritime atmosphere. Unwashed human bodies added another element. Bathing was infrequent at sea. Fresh water was too precious to waste on washing. Salt water could be used but left salt residue on the skin that drew moisture and caused discomfort. Most sailors went weeks or months without proper bathing. Sweat, dirt, and dead skin accumulated. The smell of unwashed bodies in crowded quarters was noticeable. Combined with damp wool, it created a human smell that was omnipresent. The smell of feet deserved particular mention. Wool stockings worn continuously for weeks developed a powerful odour. Feet sweat, and the moisture combined with bacteria produced strong-smelling compounds. In the crowded hammock space, this smell was concentrated. Breath contributed to the atmospheric smell. In the enclosed space with poor ventilation, the combined exhalations of dozens of men affected air quality. The smell was not strong, but added to the overall staleness of the air. Food odours came from the galley and from provisions stored below. Salt meat had its own smell. Ship's biscuit, often infested with weevils, added a musty grain smell. Cheese developed strong odours as it aged. Onions and other vegetables contributed their scents. These food smells were generally less offensive than the other sources, but they added to the complexity. A sailor could detect different provisions by smell, useful when navigating dark storage areas. Lamp oil and candle tallow added smoky, oily smells when burned. Though fire was restricted, the permitted lights produced these odours. They mixed with the other smells, adding yet another layer to the atmosphere. Tobacco smoke was present when men were allowed to smoke. Pipes were common among sailors. The smoke lingered in enclosed spaces, adding its sharp, distinctive smell to the mix. Some found tobacco smoke pleasant or at least neutral. Others found it irritating. The smell of damp wood itself was present. Old oak, constantly wet and never fully drying, developed a characteristic odour. It was different from fresh wood, older, deeper, almost musty. The entire wooden structure contributed this smell. Canvas and rope had their own smells, especially when damp. Hemp rope had an organic, plant-like smell. Canvas smelled of the fabric itself plus whatever it had absorbed from the environment. Both were subtle compared to the stronger odours but added to the overall complexity. The metallic smell of iron was subtle but present. The cannons and other metal fixtures developed a characteristic odour, especially when touched or heated by friction. This smell mixed with the others in the gun deck's atmosphere. The combination of all these sources created what can only be described as the ship's smell. It was unique to the maritime environment. Once experienced, it was instantly recognisable. Sailors carried this smell in their clothes and probably became unable to smell it themselves. Habituation was essential. The human nose adapts to constant odours. After initial exposure, the intensity perceived decreases dramatically. Sailors living in this environment daily simply stopped smelling most of it. This habituation was necessary for function. If sailors remained constantly aware of the smell, it would be distracting and demoralising. The nose's ability to adapt allowed them to ignore what they could not change. New sailors or visitors experienced the full intensity. Accounts describe men coming aboard for the first time being overwhelmed by the smell. It took days or weeks for their noses to adapt. During this period, nausea was common. The smell was worse in certain conditions. When hatches were closed during storms, the lack of ventilation allowed odours to concentrate. The air became thick and heavy with accumulated smells. This was when the atmosphere was most oppressive. In these conditions, breathing itself became unpleasant. Each breath brought the full complexity of odours. The closed space meant no escape. Sailors had to simply endure until hatches could be opened again. Fresh air, when it came, was intensely appreciated. Opening hatches after a storm allowed wind to sweep through the lower decks. The relief of clean air was palpable, but within hours, the ship's characteristic smells reasserted themselves. The smell affected sleep in ways that were mostly unconscious. The atmospheric quality influenced breathing depth and pattern. Heavy odour-laden air might lead to shallower breathing. This reduced oxygen intake and could affect sleep quality. However, exhaustion overcame discomfort. Men slept despite the smell, just as they slept despite the cold and dampness. The body's need for rest was stronger than the discomfort of the environment. The smell also served as a form of information. Experienced sailors could detect changes in the atmosphere. A sudden intensification of bilge smell might indicate rising water levels. The smell of smoke where there should be none indicated danger. This monitoring was often subconscious. The nose processed information continuously, alerting conscious attention only when something deviated from the expected pattern. This made the smell a safety feature despite its unpleasantness. Pirates experienced similar smells, but perhaps in more concentrated form. Smaller vessels with less attention to maintenance might have worse bilge conditions. Less frequent opportunities to wear bedding and clothing would intensify the human and wool smells. The officers' quarters, being more enclosed and better maintained, had somewhat different atmospheric conditions. Better ventilation and fewer occupants reduced the concentration of human smells, but even these spaces were not free from the bilge and tar smells that permeated the entire vessel. The smell was seasonal. In summer, bacterial action and heat intensified most odours. The bilge smell became worse. Bodies sweated more, intensifying that component. In winter, cold reduced some odours, but could not eliminate them. The winter smell was characterised by damp wool and accumulated mustiness. The cold prevented some bacterial processes that caused summer's worst odours, but it trapped moisture that created other smell issues. Understanding the scent of the wooden world completes the sensory picture. Sailors did not rest in neutral-smelling spaces. They slept surrounded by a complex mixture of odours that defined their environment as completely as the sounds and temperatures. These smells were inescapable and largely unavoidable. They were the price of living in close quarters aboard wooden ships with limited sanitation and no ventilation system. Sailors accepted them because they felt they had no alternative. The atmospheric quality affected quality of life but did not prevent survival. Men breathed, slept, and functioned in this environment. The human capacity for adaptation allowed them to endure conditions that seem almost unimaginable to those accustomed to clean, well-ventilated spaces. The smell was part of the wooden world's character, as fundamental as the creaking timbers or the cold hull planks. It defined the space where sailors spent their nights, surrounding them as completely as the darkness, becoming part of the background of maritime existence.